Picture a world where the fate of nations didn't just rest on the battlefield, but in the silent, shadowy corners of candlelit rooms, passed on scraps of paper, and whispered between agents who were masters of deception. This was the real theater of war, a hidden stage where a single secret could change the course of history, and where the identities of the players have been lost to time, leaving behind only tantalizing clues and unanswerable questions. For every grand historical event we think we understand, there is often a parallel story written in code and intrigue, a narrative of espionage so effective that its greatest triumphs remain its deepest, most enduring mysteries. These aren't just forgotten footnotes, they are gaping holes in our understanding of the past, locked room puzzles from a bygone era that continue to challenge historians and fuel endless speculation. Today, we're going to step into that world not as distant observers, but as detectives armed with the evidence that remains. We are about to embark on a journey through 25 of history's most perplexing espionage cases, stories where the trails went cold, the agents vanished, and the truth was buried under layers of disinformation and legend. From a mole who crippled a superpower's intelligence apparatus and was never found, to the enigmatic author of a secret declaration that may have sparked a revolution, these are the files that have never been closed. They represent the ultimate what if, challenging everything we think we know and inviting us to look closer at the official record, to question the accepted narrative, and to listen for the whispers that history has tried to silence. This journey isn't just about uncovering facts, it's about connecting with the very human drama of betrayal, loyalty, and brilliant, audacious cunning. It's about the thrill of the puzzle, the satisfaction of connecting dots separated by decades, and the shared curiosity that makes us wonder who these shadowy figures really were. So get ready to dust off century-old case files and examine the evidence for yourself. We're about to dive into the clandestine world of spies and secrets, where the most compelling stories are the ones that were never meant to be told, and where the greatest secrets are still waiting to be discovered. Our journey begins not in a smoke-filled backroom of the 20th century, but in the opulent, absolute court of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. It was an era defined by splendor and power, yet it also produced one of the most enigmatic and enduring puzzles in the entire history of state secrets, the prisoner known only as the Man in the Iron Mask. For over 3 decades, from roughly 1669 until his death in 1703, this unknown man was held in the highest security prisons in France, including the infamous Bastille. His true identity was so dangerous, so volatile, that it was hidden behind a barrier of absolute silence and a mask, which historical accounts suggest was actually made of black velvet, not iron, a detail lost to sensationalized legend. The conditions of his confinement were as peculiar as they were severe. He was treated with the respect due to a person of high rank, provided with fine food and clothing, but under the strictest orders that his face must never be seen and his true name must never be spoken. The few guards assigned to him were forbidden to interact with him beyond the necessities of service on penalty of death. This was not a punishment for a common criminal. This was the state erasing a man from existence, burying a secret so deep that its very nature could threaten the throne itself. So who was he? The theories are as numerous as they are compelling, each one a piece of a 300-year-old jigsaw with the central piece missing. One long-standing speculation posits that he was the king's illegitimate older brother, a twin whose existence would have complicated the divine right of succession. Another suggests he was a disgraced high-ranking noble, perhaps the Count of Vermandois, who had deeply offended the monarch. There are even theories that he was the real father of Louis XIV, or a political prisoner who knew too much about a devastating scandal that could have toppled the monarchy. Each identity carries its own motive for such extreme secrecy. A hidden twin brother represents a direct challenge to the king's legitimacy. a noble who committed an unspeakable crime against the crown would need to be silenced without creating a public scandal. The truth is, the French government went to extraordinary lengths and expense to keep this one man concealed, implying that his mere existence, let alone his potential testimony, was a clear and present danger to the absolute power of Louis XIV. Ultimately, the mystery of the man in the Iron Mask endures not because of a lack of clues, but because of what his story represents, the ultimate power of a state secret. In an age before digital records and mass media, a monarch could, with enough will, make a person vanish completely. The prisoner becomes a blank slate upon which we project our fascination with the hidden machinations of power, the cruel whims of absolute rulers, and the haunting idea that a single individual could be so dangerous that his very face had to be locked away from the world. His true name and his crime died with him in the Bastille, a secret the Sun King took great pains to ensure would never see the light of day, leaving us with only the ghost of a story and an enduring symbol of history's silent, shadowed corners. While the man in the Iron Mask represents a secret meant to be buried forever, our next case involves a secret that was deliberately and brilliantly unearthed, a piece of intercepted communication that would fundamentally reshape the map of the 20th century. We move from the shadows of the Bastille to the tense, wire-tapped world of the First World War to the infamous Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, the war in Europe was a bloody stalemate. Germany, desperately seeking to break the deadlock and prevent the immense industrial and military power of the United States from joining the Allies, conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. The German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a secret diplomatic communication to the German ambassador in Mexico. Its contents were explosive. It proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. If the United States entered the war against Germany, the telegram promised, Germany would fund a Mexican invasion to reclaim its lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This wasn't just a diplomatic feeler. It was a direct incitement to war on the American continent, a deliberate attempt to open a second front that would pin down the United States and keep its armies from sailing to Europe. The story of how this message was intercepted is a masterclass in the nascent art of signals intelligence. The telegram was transmitted via several routes, including a cable line that ran under the Atlantic from Germany to the United States, which the British had cleverly tapped. The codebreakers in Room 40, the British Admiralty's legendary cryptographic unit, were already familiar with the German diplomatic ciphers. They set to work and, through a combination of mathematical brilliance and intuitive guesswork, managed to decrypt the message. The British intelligence services now held a political weapon of incalculable value, but they faced a delicate problem. Simply publishing the telegram would reveal to the Germans that their codes were broken, and it would also expose the fact that Britain was monitoring neutral American diplomatic cables, an act that could infuriate President Woodrow Wilson. They needed to orchestrate a leak that would achieve their ultimate goal, dragging America into the war without compromising their priceless intelligence capabilities. This is where the controversy that still echoes among historians takes root. The British intelligence operation to pass the telegram to the Americans was a work of espionage theater. They arranged for a British agent in Mexico to acquire a copy of the telegram as it had been resent through a different, less secure channel, creating a plausible cover story for how they obtained it without admitting they were reading American cables. When the contents were finally presented to an outraged American public in March 1917, the effect was seismic. The idea of a foreign power conspiring to dismember the American Southwest was a visceral shock, a direct attack on national sovereignty that shattered the prevailing mood of isolationism. Within a month, the United States declared war on Germany, a decision that decisively tipped the scales in favor of the Allies and ensured the eventual defeat of the Central Powers. But the lingering question remains, did British intelligence merely present the truth, or did they subtly shape it? Some historians point to inconsistencies in the various versions of the telegram and the British handling of the affair, suggesting that the text might have been deliberately altered to appear more aggressive and more directly threatening to the United States. The theory posits that Room 40, understanding the need to push a reluctant America over the edge, may have amplified the language of the promise to Mexico or made the German commitment seem more concrete than it actually was. The official records have never provided a definitive answer. While most scholars accept the telegram's authenticity in its broad strokes, the possibility of clever manipulation hangs over the entire episode. It forces us to consider that this pivotal moment, which brought America onto the world stage as a military power, may not have been a simple case of exposing a secret, but a sophisticated act of crafting a narrative. The Zimmermann telegram stands as a monumental example of how intelligence, even when based in fact, can be wielded not just to reveal, but to persuade, to provoke, and to ultimately alter the destiny of nations. Moving from the grand stage of international diplomacy that defined the Zimmermann telegram, we now enter a far more intimate and insidious world of betrayal, one that struck at the very heart of the Western alliance from within. The story of the Cambridge Five is perhaps the most devastating espionage saga of the 20th century, not because of a single intercepted message, but because of a deep systemic rot. This was not a case of a lone agent succumbing to blackmail or ideology. It was a coordinated, long-term infiltration of the British establishment by a ring of young men who had been recruited as idealistic students at the University of Cambridge in the 1930s. They were not low-level clerks or disgruntled functionaries. They were the brightest of their generation, charming, well-connected, and destined for the highest echelons of intelligence and government. And they had all made a secret, fervent commitment to the Soviet Union. The damage these 5 men inflicted is almost incalculable. At the center of the web was Kim Philby, who rose to become the head of Soviet counterintelligence within MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service. Imagine the sheer, breathtaking audacity of this situation. The man tasked with hunting Soviet spies in Britain was himself the most important Soviet spy of all. From his desk, he was able to identify British agents in the field and betray them to Moscow, leading to their certain capture and execution. He sabotaged joint Anglo-American operations and provided a constant stream of the West's most sensitive secrets. Alongside him was Donald Maclean, a high-ranking diplomat in the Foreign Office who gave Stalin detailed reports from the Allied war councils during World War II, and later crucial information on the development of the atomic bomb. Guy Burgess, a flamboyant and chaotic figure, acted as a vital link and recruiter, while John Cairncross passed on thousands of documents from the government code and cipher school, including vital intelligence that helped the Soviets win the pivotal tank battle at Kursk. Finally, there was Anthony Blunt, the esteemed surveyor of the King's Pictures, who used his access as a member of the MI5 intelligence service to warn Burgess and Maclean at the critical moment, enabling their dramatic defection to Moscow in 1951. The true, chilling mystery of the Cambridge Five, however, is not the damage we know they caused, but the possibility that the story we have is incomplete. Decades of investigation and the partial opening of Soviet archives have confirmed these 5, but intelligence historians and former KGB officers have consistently suggested the ring was larger. The code name given to the group by the Soviets was actually the Magnificent Five, implying a known set number, but whispers and clues point to other, as yet unidentified figures, often referred to as a 5th man beyond the known 4 who were exposed before Blunt, or even a 6th and 7th. The nature of their recruitment targeted by a sophisticated Soviet operation at a specific time and place, during a period of widespread ideological sympathy for communism among the British intellectual elite, makes it entirely plausible that other talented individuals were successfully placed and never uncovered. These would be the ultimate ghosts, men and women who may have lived out their entire lives in honored positions within the British government, civil service, or academia, their youthful secret forever buried. The question of how many more there were is the case's enduring legacy, a haunting suspicion that the most successful penetration of Western intelligence in history was even more extensive than we ever feared, leaving a shadow over an entire generation of the British establishment. From the shadowy world of human betrayal, we now turn to a tale of lost beauty, a mystery that revolves around an object of such staggering artistry and value that its disappearance has been called the greatest art heist in history. The story of the Amber Room is one of almost mythical proportions, beginning with its creation as a symbol of peace and ending in the chaotic fires of World War. Originally commissioned by the first King of Prussia in the early 1700s, the chamber was a marvel of Baroque craftsmanship. Imagine an entire room, not of wallpaper or paint, but of solid amber, a fossilized resin that glows with a warm, honeyed light. Skilled artisans mounted these panels on a framework of gold leaf, punctuated by glittering mirrors and intricate Florentine mosaics made of semi-precious stones. It was, by all accounts, a breathtaking spectacle, a space that seemed to capture and magnify light itself, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly splendor. This masterpiece of diplomatic gift-giving was presented to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia in 1716, solidifying a Prussian-Russian alliance against Sweden. The panels were installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, where they were expanded and refined by Italian and German designers over the years, eventually covering an area of about 180 square feet and containing over 6 tons of amber. For 2 centuries, it stood as one of the crown jewels of the Russian Empire, an eighth wonder of the world that drew gasps from all who saw it. But this golden treasure was destined for a dark chapter. When Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the curators at the Catherine Palace knew the Amber Room was a prime target. In a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to save it, they tried to conceal the panels behind wallpaper. However, amber is incredibly fragile, and the material began to crumble when they tried to remove it. The German army grouped north following a specific order to seize cultural treasures, simply tore the room apart, carefully crating up the panels and shipping them to Königsberg Castle in East Prussia, which was then part of Germany. It was in the medieval halls of Königsberg Castle that the Amber Room was put on display one last time, a war trophy for the Nazi regime. But as the war turned against Germany and the Soviet Red Army closed in on the city in early 1945, the room's fate becomes the central, agonizing mystery. The official German directive was to dismantle the panels and evacuate them to a safer location. Witnesses reported seeing the crates being loaded onto a ship, the Karlsruhe, while others claimed the priceless panels were stored in the castle's cellars. Then, in the final, brutal assault on Königsberg, the castle itself was heavily bombarded and set ablaze. Did the Amber Room burn to ashes in that inferno, its delicate amber panels and gold leaf consumed by the flames? Or was it successfully smuggled out in the final, chaotic days of the war, hidden away by Nazis who intended to retrieve their plunder after the dust settled? This question has fueled a global treasure hunt for decades, spawning countless theories and expeditions that have all ended in dead ends. One of the most persistent leads points to the German steamer Karlsruhe, which left Königsberg in a hurry and was subsequently sunk by Soviet bombers in the Baltic Sea. Divers have examined the wreck, finding crates in its hold, but none have contained the amber panels. Other investigators are convinced the treasure was hidden in a secret network of bunkers, mines, or tunnels across what is now Poland and Germany. Expeditions have scoured everything from an abandoned silver mine to a long-forgotten lagoon, following coded diaries and cryptic maps only to find nothing. There are even more exotic theories suggesting the entire shipment was part of a clandestine operation that moved it to South America, or that it was discovered and secretly kept by the Soviet authorities themselves. The tantalizing possibility that the Amber Room still exists, hidden in a salt mine or a forgotten cellar waiting to be rediscovered, is what keeps the legend alive. Unlike a human spy who can die and take their secrets to the grave, a physical object of such immense cultural and monetary value is a tangible ghost. Its absence is a permanent, aching void in the world's artistic heritage. The mystery is a poignant reminder that war's destruction isn't just measured in human lives, but also in the loss of sublime beauty, a treasure crafted as a peace offering that was ultimately devoured by the very conflict it was meant to prevent. The search continues, driven by the haunting hope that one of history's most radiant creations might yet emerge from the shadows. Leaving behind the wars and political betrayals of the modern era, we now confront a mystery crafted not from actions but from pure, impenetrable information. Its name is the Voynich manuscript, and it is arguably the world's most famous unreadable book. Imagine discovering a volume that looks and feels like a genuine medieval text, filled page after page with elegant, looping script in a language that no one on earth can recognize. It's illustrated with bizarre, unidentifiable plants, mysterious astronomical charts featuring unknown constellations, and intricate drawings of tiny, nude women bathing in what appear to be interconnected green, plumbing-like systems. This is not a plot from a fantasy novel. This is a real, physical object that has resisted every single attempt to understand it for centuries. Carbon dating has firmly placed its vellum pages between 1404 and 1438, placing its creation in the early Renaissance. Yet, despite being studied by the greatest minds in cryptography, linguistics, and history, including teams of codebreakers from both world wars who successfully cracked complex enemy ciphers, the manuscript's text remains a perfect, stubborn secret. The core of the mystery lies in the writing itself. The script is composed of what scholars call Voynichese, an alphabet of roughly 20 to 30 unique characters that flow in a seemingly grammatical structure, with words and sentence-like patterns that follow statistical rules similar to known human languages. It's not random gibberish. It possesses a coherent internal logic that suggests it conveys actual meaning. This very structure is what has tormented cryptanalysts for generations. They have applied every tool in the arsenal, from frequency analysis to complex code-breaking algorithms, searching for patterns that would reveal a substitution cipher, a shorthand, or an encoded version of Latin, Hebrew, or Arabic. Every time a researcher claims a breakthrough, the wider academic community quickly finds a fatal flaw in the method. The text defies all of them. It's as if the author was fluent in a system of communication designed to be understood by only one person, or perhaps by no one at all, creating a puzzle with no key. This profound and enduring failure has naturally given rise to a spectrum of theories that range from the scholarly to the spectacularly speculative. On one end, there is the compelling possibility that the manuscript is an elaborate and highly skilled hoax, perhaps created by a clever forger like Edward Kelly, or even the manuscript's namesake, the Polish book dealer Wilfred Voynich, who brought it to light in 1912. The argument here is that the text is meaningless, a complex nonsense crafted to deceive a wealthy collector. Yet, the incredible amount of time, resources, and skill required to produce such a consistent and lengthy fake, using expensive vellum and historically accurate inks, makes this seem like an inordinately difficult scam with no clear payoff. Another school of thought posits that it is written in a genuine, but now entirely lost, natural language. Perhaps it represents a dialect that died out without a trace, or an invented constructed language, a philosophical code meant to conceal heretical or alchemical knowledge from the church. The illustrations of plants that don't exist and celestial bodies that don't match our sky could be symbolic, representing concepts in medicine, astrology, or spiritual rituals that we simply no longer comprehend. Then, of course, there are the more fringe ideas that capture the public imagination, suggesting the book is proof of early contact with extraterrestrial beings or contains knowledge from a lost, advanced civilization. While these are less likely from a historical standpoint, their very existence highlights the manuscript's unique power. It is a blank screen onto which we project our deepest curiosities and our desire for there to be answers to even the most insoluble puzzles. The Voynich manuscript is more than just an old book. It is a direct challenge from the past, a locked door for which we have not yet found the key. It sits in the Bainech Rare Book Library at Yale University, a silent testament to the fact that even in our age of information, some secrets from 600 years ago remain perfectly and mysteriously kept. From the silent, coded pages of the Voynich manuscript, we now turn to a story written not in indecipherable ink, but in the very public, sensational headlines of World War I, a story centered on a woman whose name has become synonymous with the femme fatale spy, Mata Hari. Born Margaretha Zell in the Netherlands in 1876, she crafted her own legend as an exotic dancer and courtesan in Paris, claiming to be a Javanese princess who performed sacred Eastern rituals. With her daring performances and enigmatic allure, she captivated European high society, counting military officers, politicians, and industrialists among her many lovers. It was this very network, built on fantasy and sensuality, that would place her directly in the crosshairs of French military intelligence when the war began. In February 1917, at the height of the conflict, she was arrested in her room at the Hotel Plaza Athénée in Paris, accused of being a double agent for Germany whose espionage had caused the deaths of 50,000 Allied soldiers. The image of the seductive spy was so potent, so perfectly fit the public's imagination of treachery that it has defined her for over a century. But when you pull back the curtain of legend and examine the actual evidence presented at her secret court-martial, a far more troubling and ambiguous picture emerges, one that suggests she may have been less a master spy and more a convenient pawn in a much larger, more sinister game. The case against her was astonishingly flimsy, built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. The prosecution's star witness was Captain Georges Ladoux, the head of French counterintelligence, who claimed he had recruited Mata Hari as a French agent after she offered her services. He alleged she then double-crossed him, working for the Germans under the codename H-21. The proof, a handful of intercepted, encrypted German radio messages from Madrid that mentioned an agent by that codename who had received money. The messages described H-21 as a woman who was doing well and was too expensive, beyond the fact that Mata Hari was indeed in Madrid at the time and was known for her extravagant lifestyle. There was no hard evidence directly linking her to those transmissions. No secret documents were ever found in her possession. No eyewitness ever came forward to testify to an act of espionage. The damning codename H-21 was the entire cornerstone of the case, and its connection to her was based purely on the assertion of the intelligence service that had every reason to need a conviction. This leads us to the compelling and widely held theory that Mata Hari was deliberately set up as a scapegoat. 1917 was a disastrous year for France. The army was reeling from a massive, catastrophic mutiny following the futile and bloody Nivelle offensive, where hundreds of thousands of French soldiers were slaughtered. Morale was at an all-time low, and the French public and government were desperate for answers and for someone to blame. What better target than a foreign, flamboyant, and sexually liberated woman who had consorted with men from both sides of the conflict? By painting Mata Hari as a hyper-competent, devastatingly effective German spy, French military intelligence could provide a simple, sensational explanation for the military's catastrophic failures. She became the perfect diversion, a public enemy whose dramatic execution by firing squad at the Château de Vincennes could serve as a cathartic spectacle, redirecting public anger away from the generals and politicians and onto a single, symbolic traitor. Her death was not just a punishment, it was a piece of political theater designed to restore a sense of control and national unity. Underpinning this entire tragic episode is the inescapable issue of misogyny. The evidence used against her was deeply intertwined with perceptions of her sexuality and lifestyle. Her many affairs were presented not as personal choices, but as a calculated method of gathering intelligence. Her financial demands from her lovers were framed as proof of her greed and her status as a too expensive agent. In the eyes of the all-male military tribunal, her independence, her refusal to conform to the traditional roles for women, made her inherently untrustworthy and dangerous. She was judged not merely on her actions, but on who she was perceived to be, a seductress who used her femininity as a weapon. This bias made it impossible for her to receive a fair trial. Her own defense that she was a naive woman who had played at being a spy to earn money and excitement but had ultimately been loyal to France fell on deaf ears. The narrative of the cunning, duplicitous femme fatale was simply too powerful and too useful to be contradicted by facts. So, was she a master spy or a victim? The historical consensus today leans overwhelmingly toward the latter. Declassified files and historical analysis have largely debunked the idea that she was a crucial German asset. At best, she may have engaged in some low-level gossip and intelligence dabbling, telling each side what they wanted to hear in exchange for money to fund her lavish life. She was an opportunist, not an ideologue, but she was certainly not the strategic mastermind responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands. The real mystery of Mata Hari is not what secret she sold, but why the French state was so determined to kill her. Her story endures as a somber cautionary tale about the power of sensationalism, the desperation of governments at war, and the potent, often deadly, combination of prejudice and propaganda. She remains an icon, but not of espionage. Rather, she is a haunting symbol of how a woman who dared to create her own identity could be systematically dismantled and executed to serve a national narrative. Her life sacrificed not for her crimes, but for the crimes of others. While the execution of Mata Hari was a public spectacle designed to quell unrest, our next case presents a mystery born from the opposite impulse, a secret so terrible its truth was buried for decades, giving rise to one of the 20th century's most persistent legends. The story of the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia, is a grim tapestry of revolution, brutal murder, and a ghost story that refused to die. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young Tsarevich Alexei, were led into the basement of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg. They were told they were being moved for their safety, but instead a Bolshevik firing squad awaited them. The execution was chaotic and brutal. The family was shot, bayoneted, and ultimately disposed of in an unmarked grave. The official Soviet narrative for years was simple. The entire family had been executed and the matter was closed. But the world, captivated by the tragic fate of the royal children, especially the youngest daughter Anastasia, was not so easily convinced. Almost immediately, whispers and stories began to circulate that one or more of the Romanovs had somehow survived the massacre, sparking a global obsession with lost princesses and hidden heirs that would last for generations. This is where the world of historical tragedy collides with the shadowy realm of espionage, and where a figure of almost mythical cunning enters the picture, Sidney Riley. Often called the Ace of Spies, Riley was a real-life British intelligence operative whose exploits were so audacious they seem ripped from a thriller. A master of disguise, a fluent speaker of multiple languages, and a man who moved effortlessly through the highest and lowest circles of European society, he was the archetype of the gentleman spy. In the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Revolution, with the country plunged into civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-communist Whites, British intelligence was deeply involved in covert operations aimed at undermining Lenin's new regime. One of the most tantalizing and least substantiated chapters of Riley's career is the theory that he was Agent 17, the mastermind behind a daring, last-ditch British mission to rescue the Romanov family before the execution order could be carried out. The legend suggests that Riley, operating under deep cover in Soviet Russia, concocted an elaborate plan to infiltrate the Ipatiev house and extract the royal family. The story often involves forged documents, bribed guards, and a secret network of white Russian sympathizers, all orchestrated by Riley from the shadows. Proponents of this theory point to his known presence in Russia during that period, his unparalleled talent for deception, and Britain's clear strategic interest in saving the Tsar. A restored Romanov monarchy could have served as a powerful rallying point for the White forces, potentially turning the tide of the civil war against the Bolsheviks. The dramatic appeal is undeniable, the world's greatest spy versus the revolutionary state in a race against time to save a doomed family. It's a narrative that feels destined for the history books. However, when subjected to the cold light of historical evidence, this compelling story begins to unravel. No declassified British intelligence file, no personal diary entry from Riley himself, and no credible eyewitness testimony from other agents has ever surfaced to confirm that such a rescue mission was officially sanctioned or even attempted. Historians who have meticulously studied Riley's own meticulously kept records and the archives of MI6 have found no trace of a plan dubbed Operation Romanov or anything resembling it. The grim reality is that by the summer of 1918, the Romanovs were likely seen by the British government as more of a liability than an asset. While rescuing them would have been a propaganda coup, the immense logistical difficulty and the risk of a catastrophic diplomatic incident with the nascent Soviet state may have made the venture too perilous to approve. Furthermore, the security around the Ipatiev house, controlled by fiercely loyal Bolsheviks, was far tighter than the romantic legends suggest, making a covert extraction of 7 closely watched individuals a near impossibility. So why does the legend of Sidney Riley and the Romanovs persist with such vigor? It endures because it fulfills a deep human need for a more hopeful, adventurous counter-narrative to a senseless tragedy. The confirmed, grisly fate of the family in that basement is almost too horrible to accept. The idea that the clever and vibrant Anastasia or any of the children might have escaped and lived out a life in anonymity is a powerful comfort. The figure of Sidney Riley, a man who seemed to specialize in the impossible, provides the perfect heroic agent for this alternate history. He represents the tantalizing what if the chance that history could have been different if only the right man with the right plan had been in the right place. The mystery was finally and scientifically put to rest in the 1990s with the discovery of the Romanovs' remains and subsequent DNA testing, which confirmed that the entire family, along with their servants, had indeed perished in that basement. Yet, even with this closure, the espionage lore surrounding Agent 17 remains a captivating footnote, a testament not to what actually happened, but to the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the darkness of the past. From the tragic executions of royalty, we journey to a quiet beach in post-war Australia, where a solitary death would create a mystery so layered and bizarre it remains the ultimate locked-room puzzle of the Cold War era. On the 1st of December 1948, a well-dressed man was found propped against a seawall on Somerton Beach near Adelaide, his appearance so peaceful that passers-by initially assumed he was sleeping. There were no signs of violence, no visible wounds, and his neatly pressed suit held no form of identification. The labels on his clothing had been meticulously removed, his pockets emptied of everything but a single, used bus ticket and an aluminum comb. The only thing left to identify him was his own body, and even in death, it seemed determined to guard its secrets. A subsequent autopsy revealed a shocking and perplexing finding. The man had died of heart failure, but his symptoms were consistent with a massive, undetectable poison, and his spleen was enlarged to 3 times its normal size. The coroner would conclude it was a clear case of poisoning, yet no trace of any known toxin could be found in his system, setting the stage for a medical and investigative conundrum that has never been solved. The case took its name, the Taman Shud case, from a final dramatic clue discovered months later. During a second, more thorough examination of the man's clothing, a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper was found deep in a hidden fob pocket sewn into his trousers. When carefully unrolled, it revealed 2 printed words, Taman Shud. This Persian phrase, meaning "it is ended" or "finished," was traced directly to a very rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of philosophical poems. In a stunning breakthrough, a local businessman came forward with the exact book, found discarded in the back seat of his unlocked car on the same night the body was discovered. Inside the back cover, the police found a local phone number, an unlisted number that belonged to a former nurse living in the nearby suburb of Glenelg, and a series of faint, hand-printed letters that formed a cryptic code. The nurse, when questioned, claimed she had no knowledge of the dead man, though she did admit she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a lieutenant named Alf Boksal during the war. Investigators tracked down Boksal, who was alive and well, and he still possessed his inscribed copy of the book completely intact. The trail, which seemed so promising, had abruptly ended, leaving the police with a dead end, a mysterious code, and a woman whose potential connection to the dead man was never explained. The code itself, a sequence of letters that read like a random jumble, became the central obsession of cryptanalysts for decades. It appears to be a cipher, but one that has withstood every attempt at decryption, from amateur sleuths to the top codebreakers at the Australian Security Services. The most popular theory, and the one that gives this case its espionage edge, posits that the Somerton man was a Cold War spy. The timing is certainly suggestive. 1948 was the dawn of the Cold War, a period of intense paranoia and clandestine activity. Australia was a key Western ally, and its remote, sparsely populated coastline would have been an ideal location for a covert exchange of information or the landing of an agent. The meticulous removal of all identifying marks fits the profile of a professional operative, as does the use of an untraceable poison, possibly a rare Soviet variant like digitalis. The code in the book could have been a one-time pad message, and the phone number that of his local handler, the nurse, who may have been a fellow intelligence asset. Even the phrase Taman Shud, ripped from a book about the futility of worldly endeavors, could be seen as a dramatic signal that a mission or a life had reached its predetermined conclusion. However, the spy theory, while compelling, is not without its significant holes. If this man was such a valuable asset, why was he left to die so publicly on a beach? Why would a professional spy carry such an obvious and incriminating clue as the Taman Shud scrap? An alternative, more human explanation suggests a story of tragic, forbidden love. Perhaps the man was a former lover of the nurse, a relationship that produced a child. Proponents of this theory point to distinctive genetic evidence. Both the Somerton man and the nurse's son shared a rare and specific dental trait known as diastema, where there is a gap between the 2 upper front teeth. This theory suggests the man had traveled to Adelaide to find his lost love or see his child, and the encounter ended in a suicide or an accidental overdose, with a Taman Shud note representing his broken heart and final despair. The code in this scenario might not be a cipher at all, but an acrostic or a personal mnemonic, its meaning dying with its author. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Somerton man mystery lies in its perfect storm of unanswered questions. We have a body, a book, a code, and a potential connection to a woman who took her knowledge to the grave. We have theories of high-stakes espionage and tales of personal heartbreak, yet neither provides a definitive answer. In 2022, researchers exhumed the body and used advanced DNA techniques to suggest an identity for the man, pointing to a Melbourne electrical engineer named Carl Webb. While this has provided a potential name, it has not solved the underlying mystery. It does not explain the code, the poison, his connection to the nurse, or why he was on that beach. The case remains wide open, a haunting reminder that in the modern age, a person can still vanish into the silence of their own story, leaving behind only a cryptic message and a question that the world is still trying to answer. But from the quiet, lonely mystery of Somerton Beach, we now plunge into a world of brutal pragmatism, international crime, and the morally bankrupt shadows of the Cold War. The story of the French Connection is often told as a gritty police procedural, immortalized in film, but beneath that surface lies a far darker narrative where the line between spy and criminal didn't just blur, it vanished entirely. Following the devastation of the Second World War, France was not only rebuilding its cities but also its intelligence services. The SDSR, the French External Documentation and Counter-Espionage Service, was tasked with restoring France's global influence and, most critically, fighting a clandestine war against the spread of communism. This was an expensive endeavor, one that often required funds beyond what a cautious government was willing to allocate. And so, according to decades of investigation and testimony, a Faustian bargain was struck. To finance its covert anti-communist operations abroad, particularly against nationalist and leftist movements in its colonies and beyond, elements within the SDSR are alleged to have turned a blind eye to, or even actively protected, one of the most prolific heroin trafficking networks in history. The mechanics of this arrangement were as ingenious as they were cynical. The Corsican underworld, with its deep roots in the Marseille port and a long history of resistance and clandestine activity, controlled a sophisticated pipeline. They would acquire raw morphine base from Turkish opium growers, ship it to hidden laboratories in Marseille where it was refined into pure, high-quality heroin, and then transport the final product across the Atlantic to the exploding market in the United States. This was the infamous French Connection, a network that at its peak supplied nearly 90% of the heroin consumed in America, fueling a devastating addiction crisis. The key to the Corsicans' staggering success was not just their criminal acumen, but the persistent, unshakable rumor of a protective shield. Police investigations, both French and American, would repeatedly run into invisible walls. Key witnesses would suddenly retract their statements or meet with fatal accidents. Shipments would move through heavily guarded ports without a single inspection. It was as if the traffickers had a guardian angel with the highest possible clearance, one who could anticipate raids and neutralize threats from within the system. The most compelling figure linking this world of narcotics to the world of espionage was a man named Antoine Guérini, a powerful Corsican crime lord in Marseille. Guérini was not just a gangster, he was a decorated war hero from the French resistance, a background that gave him personal connections and a certain credibility within the intelligence and political establishment. Investigative journalists and some law enforcement officials began to piece together a disturbing picture. Guérini's organization was allowed to operate its heroin labs with impunity, and in return, he and his associates acted as unofficial enforcers for the SDSR. They provided deniable muscle for operations the government couldn't officially sanction, including assassinations of enemies of the state and brutal counter-strikes against communist-aligned unions that threatened port operations. The drug money, funneled through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts, became a secret slush fund, financing everything from weapons purchases for covert wars in Indochina and Algeria to bribes for foreign officials. The very addiction ravaging American cities was, according to this theory, subsidizing France's clandestine fight to maintain its crumbling empire. Of course, definitive proof is as elusive as the spies themselves. The SDSR officially denied any involvement, and the murky nature of the evidence, whispered testimony from convicted traffickers, fragmented intelligence reports, and the stubborn dead ends in every major investigation, has allowed the story to remain in the realm of dark speculation. Skeptics argue that the corruption was more mundane, that it was simply local police and customs officials on the take, not a grand strategic conspiracy at the highest levels of intelligence. Yet the scale and longevity of the protection, which lasted well into the 1970s, suggest a coordination that goes far beyond petty graft. The French Connection wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was an open secret, a hydra that seemed to grow two new heads every time one was cut off, because the body was being nourished by the state itself. This case forces us to confront the terrifying logic of the Cold War, where the fight against one perceived evil could justify an alliance with another, creating a monster that would ultimately inflict its own unique form of collateral damage on an unsuspecting world. While the shadowy deals of the French Connection reveal how espionage could corrupt from within, our next case takes us to a place where secrecy was wielded as a shield for brilliance, protecting the very origins of the modern computer age. We now travel to the English countryside during the darkest days of the Second World War, to a sprawling, slightly shabby Victorian estate known as Bletchley Park. This was the Allies' most vital secret weapon, a clandestine university of the mind where the greatest intellectual effort of the war was undertaken, breaking the supposedly unbreakable ciphers of Nazi Germany. We know the names of some of its stars, like the legendary Alan Turing, whose theoretical work on a machine called the bomb provided the conceptual leap to crack the German Enigma code. But for every famous name, there were thousands of others whose contributions were swallowed by the same secrecy they swore to uphold. These are the Bletchley Park ghosts, the unnamed and unsung heroes whose full roster and complete achievements remain one of espionage history's most significant and deliberately obscured mysteries. The scale of the operation was staggering. At its peak, Bletchley Park employed close to 10,000 people, a veritable army of mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle wizards, and clerical workers. They were recruited from every corner of British society, often for a skill spotted in a competition or a unique linguistic flair. They worked in total silence in wooden huts scattered across the grounds, each hut dedicated to a different cipher or a different piece of the puzzle. Their oath of secrecy was not just a formality, it was a core part of their identity, a burden they carried for decades after the war ended. The Official Secrets Act bound them to silence, and they obeyed, their stories locked away in personal memories and in filing cabinets stamped top secret. This means that even today, we do not have a complete picture of who was there. While major figures have been identified, countless others worked in anonymity. They were the young women who operated the clattering bomb machines for 12-hour shifts, the clerks who sorted millions of intercepted messages, and the indexers who painstakingly cross-referenced every decoded fragment. Their collective genius was the true miracle of Bletchley, a symphony conducted in whispers, and it wasn't just the personnel whose identities were hidden, it was the full extent of their triumphs. We celebrate the breaking of the Enigma, but that was just one of many ciphers targeted. The Germans also used the Lorentz cipher, a far more complex system used for high-level communications between Hitler and his generals. The machine built to defeat it, Colossus, was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer, a breakthrough so monumental that its very existence was classified for 30 years after the war. Its engineering secrets lost to the commercial world in order to protect state security. Furthermore, the intelligence product itself, dubbed Ultra, was so sensitive that its use had to be carefully choreographed. The Allies couldn't act on every piece of decoded information for fear of revealing the source. This meant that ships were sometimes allowed to be sunk, and battles had to be fought without the full advantage of foreknowledge, all to protect the greater secret. The agonizing moral calculus of these decisions, made by unknown men and women in the huts of Bletchley, is a history that is still not fully written. This leads to one of the most tantalizing unresolved questions. Just how many specific German agents and networks were compromised because of Bletchley's work? We know of the grand strategic victories, like the foreknowledge that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boat wolf packs or the deception plans before D-Day. But the operational and tactical intelligence, the identities of individual German spies operating in Britain, and the precise methods used to feed them false information remains partially locked away. The double-cross system, which turned every single German agent in Britain into a double agent working for the Allies, was heavily reliant on the intelligence veracity provided by Bletchley Park. The codebreakers could read the messages from Berlin to its agents, confirming they believed the false intelligence being sent back. The full roster of these turned agents and the specific, brilliant deceptions they enacted, which may have included influencing battles across Europe, is a jigsaw puzzle with many pieces still held in classified archives. The silence of the Bletchley ghosts was so effective that it arguably created a new kind of historical void, one where the sheer scale of the success makes it impossible to ever fully document every life saved or every battle won because of their silent, relentless work in the English countryside. Yet from the covert triumphs of Bletchley Park, we must now turn to a story where intelligence work was not a tool for victory, but a weapon of profound injustice, a case that tore a nation apart and exposed the dark underbelly of institutional prejudice. The Dreyfus Affair is more than a historical espionage case. It is a seismic event that cracked open the foundation of French society, pitting army against army, family against family, in a bitter conflict over truth and honor. It began in 1894 with a simple yet devastating discovery: a torn-up note, a bordereau, found in a wastebasket at the German embassy in Paris by a French cleaning woman who was working as a spy. The memo promised to deliver secret French military documents to the Germans. The hunt for the traitor was on, and the Army High Command quickly focused on a single suspect, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, an artillery officer from a wealthy, assimilated Jewish family from Alsace. Dreyfus was an outsider in the almost exclusively Catholic and aristocratic French officer corps. He was intellectual, reserved, and wealthy, characteristics that made him a target for envy and suspicion. The evidence against him was flimsy at best, resting almost entirely on a superficial analysis of handwriting that some experts claimed was a match, while others vehemently disputed. Despite the lack of proof, Dreyfus was arrested, subjected to a secret court-martial, and found guilty of high treason based on a dossier of secret evidence that his own lawyer was not permitted to see. The public spectacle that followed was chilling. In a ceremony of military degradation in January 1895, Dreyfus was paraded before a jeering crowd, his insignia torn from his uniform and his sword broken. He maintained his innocence, crying out to the crowd, "I swear that I am innocent. I remain worthy of serving in the army." He was then shipped off to spend the rest of his life in horrific conditions on Devil's Island, a remote, disease-ridden penal colony off the coast of South America. For the French establishment, the case was closed. A traitor had been found and punished, but the matter refused to die, thanks almost entirely to the unwavering determination of one man, Dreyfus's brother, Matthew, and a small, growing band of supporters who believed in his innocence. Their champion on the inside was Lieutenant Colonel Georges Piquart, the new and ambitious head of the Army's intelligence section. Piquart, initially no friend to Dreyfus, made a shocking discovery in 1896. He realized that the spying for Germany had not stopped with Dreyfus's imprisonment. The same kind of secret documents were still being passed to the Germans. The real traitor was a French infantry major of Hungarian descent named Ferdinand Walson Esterhazy, a man drowning in debt and living a dissolute life. Piquart found a sample of Esterhazy's handwriting and saw it was a perfect match for the infamous bordereau. He took this evidence to his superiors, expecting them to right a terrible wrong. Instead, he was met with a wall of hostility and evasion. He was told to leave the matter alone, with one general famously stating, "What do I care if that Jew stays on Devil's Island?" When Piquart persisted, he was reassigned to a remote post in Tunisia, effectively exiled for daring to challenge the official narrative. This was the moment the Dreyfus affair transformed from a simple miscarriage of justice into a vast criminal conspiracy within the French military high command. The army had chosen to protect a known traitor, Esterhazy, in order to avoid the embarrassment of admitting they had convicted an innocent man. They fabricated evidence, suppressed exculpatory documents, and orchestrated a campaign of disinformation to smear anyone who dared to question the verdict. The affair was no longer about espionage, it was about a conspiracy to uphold a lie. The battle to free Dreyfus now exploded into the public sphere, largely thanks to the power of the press. In January 1898, the renowned author Émile Zola published his explosive open letter, J'accuse, on the front page of a Paris newspaper. In it, he directly and courageously named the generals and officials involved in the cover-up, accusing them of obstruction of justice and anti-Semitism. The publication was a sensation, leading to Zola's own trial for libel and forcing the affair onto the national stage. France split into two warring camps, the Dreyfusards, who believed in justice and truth, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who saw the campaign as an attack on the honor of the army and the nation itself. The controversy exposed deep fissures in French society between the progressive, republican values of the French Revolution and the conservative, nationalist, and often deeply anti-Semitic forces of the old order. It was a culture war fought in newspapers, cafes, and the halls of government. Under immense public pressure, Esterhazy was finally court-martialed in 1898, only to be acquitted in a sham trial that shocked the world. But the momentum was unstoppable. Later that year, the forgeries used to convict Dreyfus were uncovered, and the officer who had manufactured them confessed before killing himself in his jail cell. Alfred Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island for a second court-martial in 1899. In an act of breathtaking judicial cowardice, he was found guilty again, but with extenuating circumstances, and was immediately pardoned by the President of the Republic to end the national crisis. It was not until 1906 that a civilian court of appeals fully exonerated him, reinstated him into the army, and promoted him to the rank of major. He would go on to serve with distinction in the First World War. The real spy, Esterhazy, fled to England, where he lived out his days, never punished for his crimes. While justice, however delayed, was finally served for Dreyfus himself, the lingering, haunting question of the affair has always been the extent of the conspiracy. We know the mid-level officers who forged documents and suppressed evidence were punished, but what about those at the very top? The evidence strongly suggests that high-ranking officials in the War Ministry and the General Staff were fully aware of the cover-up from an early stage. They actively participated in the obstruction of justice to protect the institution of the army from scandal, even if it meant leaving an innocent man to rot. The identities of these highest-level conspirators, the men who gave the orders to exile Piquart and perpetuate the lie, were never officially uncovered or held accountable. Their motives were a toxic blend of institutional pride, nationalist fervor, and a deep-seated anti-Semitism that saw Dreyfus as a convenient sacrifice. The Dreyfus affair ultimately stands as a permanent warning of what can happen when any institution, no matter how revered, places its own reputation above truth and justice, and how the ghosts of those who orchestrated such injustices can remain forever hidden in the unlit corridors of power. While the Dreyfus affair exposed systemic corruption in the name of national honor, our next case presents a modern dynasty that has institutionalized secrecy and criminal enterprise as a primary tool of statecraft. Hidden deep within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of North Korea, an organization so covert exists that its very name sounds like something from a spy novel, Room 39. Also known as Bureau 39, this is not a literal room but an entire government division operating directly under the guidance of the ruling Kim family. Its singular, ruthless mission is to generate vast sums of foreign currency for the leadership, bypassing international sanctions and funding the regime's lavish lifestyle and its costly nuclear weapons program. Think of it as the personal slush fund of a totalitarian state, but one that operates not through taxation or legitimate trade, but through a global network of illicit activities that range from sophisticated counterfeiting to outright smuggling, all orchestrated from the shadows of Pyongyang. The origins of Room 39 date back to the 1970s under Kim Il-sung, the nation's founding leader, who recognized the need for a steady stream of hard currency independent of the struggling state-run economy. The Bureau was tasked with finding creative and deniable ways to bring in American dollars, Japanese yen, and European euros. Over the decades, it has evolved into a highly sophisticated criminal enterprise, allegedly divided into departments specializing in specific illegal ventures. One of its most audacious and well-documented operations involved counterfeiting United States $100 bills, producing such high-quality replicas that they were dubbed superdollars. These forgeries were so perfect with the correct paper composition and embedded security strips that they could reportedly fool standard bank equipment. For years, these superdollars flooded the global black market, generating hundreds of millions of dollars for the regime until a concerted international crackdown in the 2000s made the operation more difficult, though likely not impossible, to continue. Beyond counterfeit currency, Room 39 has been repeatedly linked to international drug trafficking. In the 1970s and 80s, North Korean diplomats were caught on multiple continents using their diplomatic pouches, which are protected from search by international law, to smuggle narcotics. The most infamous incident occurred in 1976, when a North Korean diplomat in Egypt was arrested with half a ton of hashish. This pattern shifted in the 90s to the mass production of methamphetamine, which could be manufactured in state-run chemical plants and then shipped abroad through criminal networks in Southeast Asia and China. The scheme provides a double benefit. It brings in enormous profits while also contributing to social instability in rival nations. Insurance fraud has also emerged as a lucrative racket. North Korean state-owned shipping companies have been accused of deliberately over-insuring old, barely seaworthy vessels, loading them with low-value cargo, and then scuttling them in international waters to collect massive payouts from foreign insurance firms. Each of these schemes reveals a chilling pragmatism, a willingness to treat the entire global system as a target for systematic plunder. The real, enduring mystery of Room 39, however, is not what it does, but how it operates with such impunity. The entire organization is shrouded in a level of secrecy that makes the CIA or KGB look transparent by comparison. Defectors have provided glimpses describing a network of front companies, shell corporations, and joint ventures scattered across Asia, Europe, and even Africa. These entities, often registered in the names of trusted officials or unwitting foreign partners, are used to launder the illicit funds and facilitate transactions. The Bureau is believed to control a fleet of ghost ships that frequently change their names and registrations to evade tracking, and it utilizes a core of loyal operatives who move seamlessly between the worlds of diplomacy, business, and organized crime. Because the North Korean state is essentially a criminal enterprise itself, there is no internal oversight, no free press to investigate, and no whistleblowers who can safely come forward. The few defectors who have spoken about Room 39 often provide fragmented or slightly conflicting accounts, leading analysts to believe that the organization's structure is deliberately fluid, constantly adapting and creating new subsidiaries to stay ahead of international law enforcement. This leads to the greatest unanswered question: what is the full, global extent of Room 39's web? We know of the activities that have been exposed through arrests and intelligence reports, but these are likely just the tip of the iceberg. The Bureau is thought to have invested its billions in legitimate businesses overseas, from restaurants and casinos to real estate in cities like London and Singapore, further obscuring the origin of the funds and integrating the regime into the global economy it publicly condemns. There are persistent, though difficult to prove, allegations of its involvement in wildlife trafficking, cybercrime, and even the smuggling of conflict minerals. The true power of Room 39 lies in its anonymity. It is a ghost in the machine of global finance, a secret agency that fuels one of the world's most isolated and dangerous nations. Its continued existence is a stark reminder that in the 21st century, espionage and statecraft are not just about stealing secrets, but about mastering the dark arts of the international underworld to ensure a dictator's survival, no matter the cost to the rest of the world. Yet from the shadowy financial networks of modern statecraft, we are pulled back in time to a scene of pure Gothic mystery, a disappearance so sudden and complete it feels like a page torn from a supernatural thriller. The story of Benjamin Bathurst unfolds not in the grand ballrooms of diplomacy, but on a cold, muddy street in a small German town, a case that has become the archetype of the vanished without a trace enigma. In November 1809, Europe was locked in the titanic struggle of the Napoleonic Wars. Bathurst, a young and promising British diplomat, was on a high-stakes secret mission. His task was to travel to Vienna and bolster the alliance between Britain and the Austrian Empire against the French. The mission was a failure. Napoleon had soundly defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram, and the Austrian court, now subservient to France, was a hostile environment for a British envoy. With his diplomatic work undone, Bathurst began the perilous journey back to London, carrying with him sensitive dispatches that detailed the fragile state of European alliances. His route took him through the heart of German territory that was either under French control or thick with French agents and sympathizers, making him a man with a target on his back. It was on the afternoon of November 25th that Bathurst and his German courier arrived at the busy posting inn in the town of Perleberg. Witnesses later reported that the young diplomat was visibly agitated, a state of mind that had been growing for days. The pressure of his failed mission, combined with the constant, palpable fear of being captured by Napoleon's secret police, had taken a severe toll. He was overheard muttering about being followed, convinced that French agents were closing in on him. This wasn't just simple anxiety, it was a profound and consuming paranoia. After a meal at the inn, he decided that a change of horses and carriage was necessary to throw off any potential pursuers. As dusk began to settle over the town, his carriage was brought around to the front of the inn. Bathurst, after speaking a few words to his courier, stepped around to the far side of the horses, ostensibly to check the harness or the mounting. It was the last time he was ever seen. In the space of a few heartbeats, in full view of a bustling coaching inn, the Honourable Benjamin Bathurst, a trusted envoy of the British Crown, simply ceased to exist. The immediate aftermath was one of utter confusion. His courier, expecting him to reappear at any moment, grew concerned as minutes stretched into an hour. A search was organized, lanterns were lit, and the town was scoured, but Bathurst was gone. The only physical clue left behind was a pair of his fur-lined trousers found discarded in the stable. More chillingly, days later, a local woman discovered Bathurst's prized pistols, which he always carried, hidden inside the cushion of a sofa in a room at the inn where he had briefly rested. It was as if he had been preparing for a confrontation he never had, or as if someone had carefully staged the scene to create confusion. The most intensive investigation was launched, ordered by Bathurst's powerful and distraught family, and even involving the Prussian king. Dozens of people were questioned, rivers were dragged, and nearby woods were combed. Yet not a single trace of the man, his expensive watch, his money, or the vital diplomatic papers he carried was ever found. It was a vanishing act of impossible perfection. This utter lack of evidence has naturally given rise to a spectrum of theories, each attempting to solve a puzzle with no edges. The most straightforward explanation is one of simple robbery and murder. Perleberg was known to be a rough town, frequented by deserters and highwaymen. Perhaps Bathurst, with his fine clothes and visible wealth, was targeted by local criminals who lured him away from the inn and killed him, disposing of the body in some remote location that was never found. Yet, this theory fails to explain the bizarre placement of his pistols or the fact that such a crime would almost certainly have required multiple people, making a permanent silence among them highly unlikely. A second and far more compelling theory points directly to French espionage. Napoleon's ruthless secret police, led by the formidable Joseph Fouché, operated a vast network of informants and assassins across Germany. Bathurst, carrying dispatches that could have revealed British intelligence networks and future plans, was a high-value target. It is entirely plausible that he was indeed being followed, that his paranoia was justified, and that a team of French agents succeeded in abducting him the moment he stepped into the blind spot beside the carriage. In this scenario, he would have been quietly interrogated and executed, his body and documents destroyed to leave no evidence of state-sponsored murder, an act of war conducted in the shadows. But there are even darker, more speculative possibilities. Some contemporary rumors suggested that Bathurst might have staged his own disappearance, overwhelmed by the pressure and seeking to escape his life of privilege and duty. However, this seems entirely out of character for the ambitious young diplomat, and it does not account for the complete absence of any sighting of him ever again. Another chilling idea, whispered at the time, was that he fell victim to a local conspiracy involving not just criminals, but perhaps even corrupt officials at the inn itself, who saw an opportunity for profit and eliminated a troublesome foreigner. The true answer likely lies in a combination of these factors: his justified fear of French agents, which made him erratic and vulnerable, converging with the opportunistic criminality of a dangerous town. The mystery endures not because the case is cold, but because it is a perfect historical vacuum. Benjamin Bathurst stepped from the solid ground of recorded history into a void, leaving behind a question that has echoed for over 2 centuries. How can a man of such importance vanish so completely in a single moment, taking all his secrets with him into the perpetual twilight of a German evening? Now we travel from the foggy streets of Perleberg to the heart of the Cold War in Asia, to explore one of the most controversial and politically charged theories in the annals of modern espionage. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, a decade of immense social and political upheaval that began in 1966, stands as one of the most traumatic and transformative periods in Chinese history. It was a time when Mao Zedong, seeking to reclaim his revolutionary authority, unleashed the nation's youth, the Red Guards, against the very Communist Party structure he had helped build, targeting so-called bourgeois elements, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to his vision of permanent revolution. The resulting chaos saw widespread violence, the destruction of cultural artifacts, and the shattering of millions of lives. For decades, however, a persistent counter-narrative has simmered in certain academic and political circles, suggesting that this cataclysm was not solely a domestic political struggle, but was, at least in part, instigated or amplified by a foreign hand, specifically the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. To understand why such a theory could even gain traction, we must first immerse ourselves in the paranoid and high-stakes geopolitical landscape of the mid-1960s. The United States was deeply embroiled in the Vietnam War, viewing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia through the lens of the domino theory. China, under Mao, was seen as the primary sponsor and ideological engine of this expansion, a monolithic red threat that supported North Vietnam and fomented revolution across the region. From the American perspective, a China that was stable, unified, and focused on exporting its revolutionary model was an existential danger. A China that was consumed by internal chaos, however, would be too preoccupied with its own survival to effectively support its communist allies abroad. This line of thinking provides the crucial motive. If the CIA could find a way to subtly encourage or exacerbate internal divisions within the Chinese leadership to push the country toward a state of self-destructive frenzy, it would serve the strategic interests of the United States perfectly by crippling its most powerful regional adversary without firing a single shot. We know for a fact that the CIA was not a passive observer in this theater. Declassified documents and historical research have confirmed extensive covert operations aimed at destabilizing Mao's China throughout the 1950s and 60s. These included supporting Tibetan resistance fighters, parachuting nationalist Chinese agents into the mainland, and conducting relentless propaganda campaigns through radio broadcasts like Radio Free Asia. The agency's ultimate, though never realized, goal was the overthrow of the Communist Party. Given this established history of active measures, the idea that they would pass up an opportunity to exploit a visible rift within the Chinese elite is not far-fetched. The theory posits that Western intelligence, seeing Mao's growing isolation from more pragmatic party officials after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, saw an opportunity. By using clandestine channels, perhaps through double agents, manipulated media, or forged documents, they could whisper poison into the ear of the increasingly paranoid Mao, reinforcing his suspicions that his comrades were indeed capitalist roaders and traitors, thereby pushing him to launch the Cultural Revolution as a purge of his own making, but one encouraged and manipulated from the outside. However, when we move from motive and opportunity to the realm of hard, verifiable evidence, the entire theory begins to crumble into speculation. Not a single declassified CIA document, no credible defector testimony, and no internal Chinese party archive that has been accessed by scholars contains a smoking gun that outlines a plan to foment the Cultural Revolution. The chaos was simply too vast, too complex, and too deeply rooted in the internal dynamics of Chinese communism to be the brainchild of a handful of CIA case officers. The primary drivers were domestic: Mao's determination to smash the party bureaucracy that had criticized him, his ideological war against Soviet-style revisionism, and his cunning mobilization of a generation of young people who felt disenfranchised by the emerging system. The Cultural Revolution had its own internal logic and fuel. The idea that it required a CIA spark, while dramatic, drastically underestimates the agency of Mao and the powerful, homegrown forces he harnessed. Furthermore, the practical obstacles to such an operation would have been immense. China in the mid-60s was one of the most closed societies on Earth, a veritable fortress against Western influence. Penetrating the innermost circle of Mao Zedong, a man surrounded by loyalists and shielded by an extensive internal security apparatus, to the degree required to manipulate his core strategic decisions, would have been an intelligence coup of almost unimaginable proportions. If the CIA had possessed that level of access, it seems far more likely they would have used it for more direct actions, such as assassination or the promotion of a military coup, rather than the far riskier and less predictable strategy of encouraging a mass social movement. The very scale and brutality of the Cultural Revolution also worked against long-term American interests in some ways, creating a nation so unstable and unpredictable that it potentially increased the risk of a wider nuclear-armed conflict. Ultimately, the persistence of the CIA theory speaks less to historical fact and more to the potent political needs of various factions. For hardline elements within the Chinese Communist Party, even today, promoting the idea of foreign instigation serves a useful purpose. It allows them to frame the Cultural Revolution not as a catastrophic era born from within their own ideology and leadership, but as a period when the nation was victimized by a sinister foreign plot, thereby deflecting blame and reinforcing a narrative of national resilience against external enemies. Conversely, for some critics of U.S. foreign policy, the theory fits a familiar pattern of American interventionism, placing the Cultural Revolution in the same category as other proven CIA coups in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. The lack of evidence in this view is simply proof of the operation's success and the skill of its cover-up. The mystery of the CIA and the Cultural Revolution, therefore, remains a powerful historical ghost, not because of what we can prove, but because of what it reveals about our understanding of power, manipulation, and the enduring human tendency to look for a simple, external villain to explain a profoundly complex and homegrown tragedy. While the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst represents a mystery of a single vanishing individual, our next case presents a haunting collective tragedy where the legend of one unseen spy is said to have sealed the fate of tens of thousands. We now move to the muddy, rain-swept fields of northern France in the summer of 1916, to the eve of one of the most devastating battles in human history, the Battle of the Somme. The British High Command, under General Sir Douglas Haig, had prepared a meticulously planned offensive, a big push designed to break the stalemate of trench warfare and decisively overwhelm the German line. The plan relied on a week-long artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale, intended to obliterate the German barbed wire, destroy their deep bunkers, and kill or demoralize the defenders to such an extent that the following infantry would simply be able to walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered positions. It was a strategy of overwhelming force, and the British command was supremely confident in its success. Yet, from the very beginning, a chilling story began to circulate among the troops and later among historians that the Germans knew they were coming. Not just a general suspicion, but that they had been given the exact date and time of the attack by a highly placed German spy operating with stunning audacity on the British side of the lines. The evidence for this spy's existence is largely circumstantial, but when pieced together, it forms a deeply disturbing picture. The central, terrifying clue lies in the behavior of the German defenders in the days and hours leading up to the assault. British soldiers in the front line trenches reported unusually quiet and inactive German lines during the final, furious artillery barrage. This was not the sign of a shattered and broken enemy, but of an enemy that had wisely taken cover in their deepest, most secure bunkers, knowing full well that the shelling was merely a prelude and that conserving their strength was paramount. Then, at 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, when the British artillery lifted its barrage and the whistles blew to send the first waves of infantry over the top, the German defenses sprang to life with a horrifying, pre-planned efficiency. Their machine gun crews emerged from the untouched bunkers, set up their weapons on the parapets, and laid down a murderous, interlocking field of fire. The British troops, many of them volunteer units from the PALS battalions who had enlisted together from the same towns, advanced in neat, orderly lines across a no-man's land that the bombardment had failed to clear of wire or defenders. They were mown down in rows. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered almost 60,000 casualties, with nearly 20,000 killed, making it the bloodiest day in its entire history. The persistent legend holds that this catastrophic outcome was not just a failure of tactics or intelligence, but the direct result of precise foreknowledge delivered by a single, unidentified agent. The story often specifies that this spy provided the Germans with the crucial 0 hour, the exact minute the bombardment would cease and the infantry advance would begin. This would explain the Germans' perfectly timed emergence from their shelters. So who could this phantom operative have been? The theories are as varied as they are difficult to prove. Some point to the neutral Dutch border, a notorious hotspot for espionage where agents from both sides mingled and information was bought and sold. Perhaps a double agent pretending to work for the British passed the plans to a German contact. Others suggest the spy was someone much closer to the action, a disaffected British soldier, a signals officer with access to the operational orders, or even a civilian worker attached to the headquarters staff who had been turned by German intelligence. The most tantalizing possibility is that the spy was not a traditional agent at all, but a brilliant German signals intelligence operative who had managed to crack the British field codes, allowing them to read the attack orders being sent between command posts. This would mean the spy was not a person lurking in the trenches, but a mathematician sitting at a desk far behind the lines, listening to the ether. This leads us to the most agonizing question of the entire mystery. If this intelligence was so precise, why did the German High Command not appear to act on it more decisively at a strategic level? The answer may lie in the fog of war and the nature of the information itself. While the 0 hour was a critical tactical detail, the Germans may have been skeptical of the broader British plan. The idea of launching a massive infantry assault across such a wide front after a prolonged bombardment was standard military doctrine. The exact timing was the only true surprise. Furthermore, the German command structure was decentralized, and the local commanders on the Somme front who received the warning acted on it by pulling their men into bunkers and preparing their machine gun positions. The higher command, however, may have been focused on the larger strategic picture, including the simultaneous French offensive to the south, and did not divert significant reserves to reinforce the Somme sector because they believed their frontline troops could handle the assault, which, tragically, they overwhelmingly could. The spies' warning was likely seen as a tactical gift, confirming what they already suspected, rather than a strategic revelation that required a major shift in resources. The final, frustrating layer of this enigma is the complete absence of a paper trail. Despite extensive searches in both German and British archives after the war, no document has ever been found that explicitly names a specific agent as the source of the Somme intelligence. In the German records, this could be explained by the deliberate destruction of sensitive intelligence files to protect sources, or the loss of documents in the chaos of their defeat in 1918. In the British archives, the silence is even more profound. If British counterintelligence had later discovered that such a devastating breach had occurred, exposing their own catastrophic failure to protect the most important secret of the war to that point, there would have been an immense incentive to bury that fact forever. Acknowledging a spy of such magnitude would have meant admitting that the monumental sacrifice of July 1st was not merely a tragic blunder, but a preventable catastrophe, an admission no government or military institution would be eager to make public. The riddle of the Somme spy therefore stands as a ghost in the machine of history, a compelling legend born from the sheer, horrifying scale of the defeat. It is a story that may never be proven, but one that persists because it offers a singular, sinister explanation for a day of such immense and otherwise inexplicable slaughter. A day when the earth itself seemed to rise up against the British Army, perhaps because someone on their own side had already told the enemy exactly when they were coming. Imagine a tool of assassination so perfectly disguised it could be carried in plain sight within a woman's handbag, an elegant accessory that transformed in an instant into an instrument of silent death. This was the KGB's lipstick pistol, a device that sounds like a prop from a spy film but was a very real, chillingly pragmatic weapon from the Cold War's most ruthless playbook. Officially designated the kiss of death by intelligence historians, this single-shot, small-caliber firearm was ingeniously engineered to look exactly like a tube of lipstick, a common, everyday object that would never draw a second glance from security personnel or counterintelligence agents. The genius of its design lay in its flawless deception. To activate it, an operative would unscrew the cap, which was just a dummy. The real mechanism required pulling on the end of the tube which armed the firing pin. Then, by applying pressure to the side of the casing, the weapon would discharge a single 4.5mm bullet at point-blank range. It was not a weapon for a prolonged firefight, but for one specific, intimate purpose: the discreet elimination of a target at close quarters, after which the operative could simply drop the now harmless cosmetic item and melt back into the crowd. The very existence of such a device forces us to consider the specific, brutal logic of Cold War espionage. where female operatives were often deployed in roles that leveraged societal assumptions and prejudices. In an era where women were frequently underestimated by male-dominated security services, a female agent could get closer to a target with less suspicion. She could be a secretary, a translator, a journalist, or a charming socialite at a party, all personas that allowed for intimate conversation and physical proximity. The lipstick pistol was the ultimate tool for this kind of operation, a weapon that exploited the very stereotypes of femininity as its primary camouflage. It represented a shift from brute force to psychological subtlety, a move that acknowledged that the most effective assassination is the one that leaves no obvious evidence of foul play and offers no immediate suspect. The target is simply found dead with no gunpowder residue, no discarded weapon, and no witnesses who remembered anything more remarkable than a woman touching up her makeup. This leads us directly to the central, tantalizing mystery that surrounds the lipstick pistol. While several of these devices were eventually recovered by Western intelligence agencies, most notably by the American CIA and Britain's MI5, their specific operational history remains shrouded in official secrecy. We know the what and the how, but the who, where, and when are the subjects of intense speculation. There are no declassified KGB files that neatly list the missions and operatives assigned to this weapon. Instead, we have a handful of compelling, though unconfirmed, theories that attempt to connect the lipstick pistol to real-world events. One of the most persistent stories links it to the turbulent politics of Cold War Germany, suggesting it was the intended weapon for a plot to eliminate a high-profile defector or a Western diplomat in Berlin. The idea is that an agent posing as a lover or a clandestine contact would arrange a private meeting, use the pistol at the decisive moment, and then simply walk away, leaving behind a scene that looked like a sudden heart attack or a mysterious illness, with the only potential clue being a single, seemingly discarded tube of lipstick that forensic teams would have no reason to connect to. Shooting. Another layer of the mystery involves the identities of the women who carried these deadly compacts. The KGB's training programs for female operatives were extensive and rigorous, focusing on languages, seduction techniques, and the psychological fortitude required for such intimate violence. These were not just femme fatales from central casting, they were highly disciplined intelligence officers, yet their names and faces are almost entirely lost to history. Were they dedicated ideologues committed to the Soviet cause, or were they everyday women coerced into service through blackmail or patriotic duty? The most famous female KGB operatives we know of, like the incredibly effective Sparrow school graduates, typically used intelligence gathering and honey traps rather than direct assassination. The lipstick pistol implies a different, even more secretive tier of operative, one whose success was measured by the silence that followed their actions. The fact that no operative has ever come forward to claim credit or tell their story suggests that either these missions were so secret that even the participants were kept in the dark about the bigger picture, or that the women who undertook them met untimely ends, their secrets dying with them. The ultimate fate of these devices also adds to their enigmatic legacy. The few that have been displayed in museums, like the one at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., are treated as fascinating curiosities, but their presence in the West raises more questions than it answers. Were they captured from agents who were apprehended before they could act, or were they handed over by high-level defectors as proof of the KGB's ruthless ingenuity? Each recovered pistol is a silent witness to a plot that may or may not have been carried out, a potential historical turning point that exists only in the realm of what might have been. The lipstick pistol stands as a perfect symbol of the Cold War's hidden face, a conflict fought not just with missiles and tanks, but with brilliantly concealed tools and anonymous individuals whose stories remain locked away in archives we may never fully see. A chilling reminder that the most dangerous weapons are often the ones we would never think to look for. But from the silent, intimate threat of a single lipstick pistol, we now pivot to a document that was wielded like a cudgel on the global stage, a piece of paper that proponents argued justified a war and critics allege was one of the most consequential forgeries of the modern era. This is the story of the Habush letter, a controversy that lies at the very heart of the intelligence failures leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In late 2003, with the United States and Britain already deeply engaged in Iraq, a bombshell document began circulating in intelligence and media circles. It was a memo purportedly written by Tahir Jalil Habush, the long-serving head of the Iraqi intelligence service, and addressed to Saddam Hussein himself. Its contents were explosive, suggesting a direct operational link between the Iraqi regime and the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks. The letter, dated July 1, 2001, appeared to confirm that Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the 9/11 hijackers, had actually traveled to Baghdad months before the attacks for a meeting, and that the Iraqi intelligence service had subsequently trained him in the use of coded messages. For the Bush administration, which had long advocated for regime change in Iraq and had publicly tried to connect Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda, this letter seemed to be the ultimate smoking gun. Here was what appeared to be a senior Iraqi official writing to his boss, detailing a concrete relationship with the very men who had carried out the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. The potential political impact was immeasurable. It could have silenced critics who argued the Iraq War was based on fabricated or tenuous intelligence about weapons of mass destruction by providing a powerful, alternate justification rooted in 9/11. Yet, almost from the moment British intelligence services, specifically MI6, laid eyes on the document, they raised serious doubts. Their analysts concluded that the letter was probably a forgery. This assessment wasn't based on a hunch, but on a detailed forensic and contextual analysis. The language used in the letter, the bureaucratic phrasing, and the specific details of how the Iraqi intelligence service operated all seemed slightly off, not quite matching the vast repository of authentic Iraqi documents the services had accumulated over the years. The mystery of the Habush letter, therefore, is not just about its contents, but about its origins and its astonishing post-war rehabilitation. The most compelling and widely supported theory points to a clandestine operation run by elements within the Pentagon. The story, pieced together by investigative journalists and intelligence sources, centers on a man named Ahmed Chalabi, the leader of the Iraqi National Congress, an exiled opposition group that was a primary source of intelligence for the Pentagon's own intelligence unit, the Office of Special Plans. Chalabi's group had a clear and powerful motive: to provide the United States with a rationale for overthrowing Saddam Hussein, a goal they shared with neoconservative hawks in the Bush administration. According to this narrative, the forgery was crafted by Chalabi's operatives and then fed into the intelligence stream through sympathetic channels in the Pentagon, deliberately bypassing the more skeptical analysts at the CIA and the State Department who had already expressed doubts about a strong Saddam-al-Qaeda alliance. This was a case of stovepiping, where raw, unvetted intelligence is rushed directly to policymakers who are predisposed to believe it, effectively circumventing the normal, rigorous checks and balances of the intelligence community. But the intrigue doesn't end with the letter's creation. In a stunning twist, Tahir Jalil Habush, the man whose signature was on the document, was not captured or killed after the invasion. In fact, he was never found, and then an even more bizarre chapter unfolded. In 2004, the British newspaper The Sunday Telegraph published a story based on the very same Habush letter, presenting it as genuine. It was later revealed that the source for this story was the Iraqi National Congress. This created a perfect, self-reinforcing loop. A document allegedly created by one group was then fed to a newspaper by the same group, creating a public source that could then be cited as independent verification. The entire episode showcases how intelligence can be manufactured, and then laundered through the media to create a false narrative of credibility. The most haunting unanswered question, however, is who gave the final order to create this specific forgery. Was it Chalabi and his circle acting alone, or were they encouraged or directed by figures within the U.S. government who knew that a genuine, direct link between Saddam and 9/11 was the one piece of evidence that could definitively win the public argument for war? The identity of the actual forger, the person who sat down and meticulously crafted the language and format to mimic an Iraqi intelligence memo, remains unknown. Furthermore, the specific political purpose continues to be debated. Was the letter intended primarily for a public relations campaign, to sway opinion in the pages of newspapers, or was it meant for the eyes of the president and his inner circle, to harden their resolve and silence internal dissent in the final, critical run-up to the invasion? The Habush letter stands as a dark monument to a period where the lines between intelligence, propaganda, and policy became dangerously blurred. A single piece of paper whose true authorship and intent remain one of the most significant and troubling unsolved mysteries of 21st century espionage. Moving from the sanctioned forgeries of the 20th century, we journey back to a young American republic, to a case that ignited a firestorm of fear and paranoia so intense it would briefly give rise to a national political movement, all centered on the baffling disappearance of a single man. In the autumn of 1826, in the bustling canal town of Batavia, New York, a man named William Morgan made a fateful decision that would seal his destiny. Morgan was a somewhat itinerant stonemason and a master mason himself, but he had grown deeply embittered after being denied admission to the higher degree lodge in Batavia. Fueled by resentment and perhaps a desire for profit, he made a dangerous pact with a local newspaper publisher, David C. Miller. Together, they announced their intention to publish a book titled Illustrations of Masonry, a work that promised to reveal the secret rituals, handshakes, passwords, and oaths of the Freemasons in their entirety. To a modern audience, this might sound like a trivial act, but in the 1820s, Freemasonry was not just a social club. It was a powerful and pervasive institution whose members included presidents, senators, judges, and nearly every prominent man in American civic life. Its allure was built upon an aura of exclusive mystery, and Morgan was threatening to tear that curtain down, to render its sacred mysteries mere public knowledge, an act that many Masons considered an unforgivable betrayal. The reaction from the local Masonic community was swift and menacing. Even before the book could be published, pressure was applied. Morgan's home was targeted with an arson attempt, and his partner Miller's printing office was attacked by a group of men who tried to destroy the press. The tension culminated on September 11, 1826, when Morgan was arrested on a trivial charge of stealing a shirt and tie, a clear pretext to get him into custody. He was taken to the jail in Canandaigua, but the real plot was now set in motion. After his debt was paid by a mysterious stranger, Morgan was released from jail, only to be immediately seized on the street by a group of men. Witnesses reported seeing him forced into a carriage, crying out, "Murder," as he was driven away at high speed. It was the last time William Morgan was ever seen alive. A series of frantic but ultimately futile investigations followed, tracing a trail that led across New York State and suggesting he was held in various forts before being taken out onto Lake Ontario. The prevailing theory, supported by a later confession from a boatman involved, was that Morgan was ultimately drowned in the Niagara River, his body weighed down and disposed of in the powerful currents, forever lost to the depths. The public outcry over Morgan's disappearance was immediate and volcanic. Here was a citizen kidnapped in broad daylight by a group of influential men, and the justice system seemed paralyzed. The investigation was hampered at every turn by witnesses who suddenly developed faulty memories, by sheriffs and judges who were themselves Masons, and by a wall of silence that seemed to protect the perpetrators. While several men were eventually indicted and a few were convicted for their roles in the abduction, the charges were only for conspiracy to kidnap. No one was ever tried, let alone convicted, for Morgan's murder because a body was never found. This failure of justice confirmed the public's worst suspicions that a secret society had not only committed a murder but was so powerful it could operate with impunity, subverting the very legal system its members were sworn to uphold. The mystery of what exactly happened to William Morgan was thus eclipsed by the terrifying, and for many proven, fact that the Freemasons had orchestrated his vanishing and were above the law. This single event acted as a catalyst, pouring fuel on the smoldering embers of anti-Masonic sentiment that had existed for decades. The result was the explosive rise of the anti-Masonic Party, the first significant third party in American history. For a brief period, it became a potent political force, particularly in the Northeast, electing state legislators and even a governor. Its platform was built entirely on opposition to the alleged conspiracy of Freemasonry, which it painted as a shadow government that corrupted elections, controlled the courts, and placed loyalty to the lodge above loyalty to the nation. The movement gave a political voice to a deep-seated fear that the egalitarian ideals of the young republic were being undermined by a privileged, secretive elite. The Morgan affair became their rallying cry, the incontrovertible proof that their fears were justified. The mystery of his body's location was, in a political sense, almost irrelevant. His disappearance was evidence enough. Yet, this very certainty begs a critical, more nuanced question that historians still grapple with. Was William Morgan's murder a calculated, top-down order from the highest levels of Freemasonry? Or was it a disastrous, panicked overreaction by a local group of lower-level Masons who felt their honor and exclusivity were under direct attack? The official stance of Freemasonry, then and now, has always been to condemn the actions of those involved, framing it as the unauthorized work of a rogue faction. This interpretation suggests that the Batavia Masons, inflamed by anger and a misguided sense of protecting their fraternity, took matters into their own hands, perhaps intending only to intimidate Morgan or ruin his manuscript, but the situation spiraled horribly out of control, leading to an unintended death. In this view, the subsequent cover-up was not a grand conspiracy but a desperate attempt by the local members to avoid the consequences of their catastrophic mistake. The alternative perspective, the one that fueled the anti-Masonic frenzy, posits a far more organized and sinister conspiracy. The efficiency of the abduction, the use of the legal system as a trap, the seamless movement of Morgan across the state, and the impenetrable wall of silence that followed all point to a well-orchestrated operation, one that would have required coordination, funding, and a chain of command that likely extended beyond the Batavia Lodge. The fact that so many men in positions of authority, from law enforcement to the judiciary, were Masons created a structure where obfuscation was not just possible but almost inevitable. The lingering mystery, therefore, is not really about the location of Morgan's body, but about the precise nature of the conspiracy. We know the how and the why in broad strokes, but the exact chain of responsibility, the moment the decision was made to kill him rather than just silence him, and the identities of every individual who sanctioned the act from behind the scenes, remain locked within the very secrets William Morgan died trying to expose. His vanishing act became a potent and enduring American folktale, a stark reminder that the pursuit of transparency can sometimes vanish into the very shadows it seeks to illuminate. Yet the dark allure of conspiracy can transform even the most clear-cut tragedy into a hall of mirrors, and no event in modern American history has been more persistently reframed in this shadowy light than the attack on Pearl Harbor. The theory is both simple and devastatingly powerful that President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his most senior advisors knew the Japanese fleet was coming, and in a cold-blooded calculation of global strategy, they chose to let the attack proceed, sacrificing thousands of American lives to create the galvanizing shock that would finally push a reluctant, isolationist nation into the Second World War. It is a narrative of profound betrayal, one that suggests the very government sworn to protect its citizens was instead complicit in their slaughter for a greater geopolitical goal. To understand why this theory has endured for over 80 years, we must sift through the complex and fragmentary evidence that seems, at first glance, to support it, beginning with the secret intelligence the United States truly possessed in the final months of 1941. The cornerstone of the conspiracy rests upon the American success in breaking Japanese diplomatic codes, a cryptographic triumph known collectively as magic. By late 1941, U.S. intelligence was routinely reading the encrypted messages sent between Tokyo and its embassies around the world, including the one in Washington, D.C. These intercepts revealed a government in Tokyo that was preparing for war. They showed Japan's strategic focus on securing resources in Southeast Asia, its escalating frustration with American oil embargoes and diplomatic demands, and most ominously, a series of messages instructing the embassy to destroy its code machines and burn sensitive documents. Crucially, one particular intercept sent on September 24, 1941, did request the partitioning of the harbor at Pearl Harbor into grid sectors, a clear intelligence-gathering effort. For proponents of the conspiracy, this is the smoking gun. How could U.S. intelligence reading these messages not have understood that Pearl Harbor itself was the target? The implication is that they did understand, but the warnings were deliberately suppressed or ignored at the highest levels to ensure the attack achieved its devastating surprise. However, when we move from the realm of what was intercepted to the painful reality of what was actually understood, the conspiracy theory begins to falter under the weight of historical context and the fog of intelligence analysis. The magic decrypts were almost exclusively diplomatic, not military. They revealed Japan's intentions for war, but they were frustratingly silent on the specific tactics, timing, and location of an opening strike. The Japanese naval fleet operated under an entirely separate and much more secure set of military codes that the United States had not yet broken. The request for the grid of Pearl Harbor, while suspicious in hindsight, was one data point among thousands. At the time, military analysts believed that if Japan attacked, it would most likely target American bases in the Philippines or British holdings in Singapore, locations much closer to the resource-rich territories Japan actually sought to conquer. Sending a massive carrier strike force thousands of miles across the open Pacific to hit the remote Hawaiian Islands was considered a tremendous, almost suicidal strategic gamble. The prevailing bias within the intelligence community was that the Japanese military was not capable of such a complex and audacious operation, a fatal miscalculation of enemy capability, not a deliberate concealment of known facts. Furthermore, the logistics of maintaining such a conspiracy are almost unimaginably complex. For the plot to be true, it would have required the complicit silence of not just President Roosevelt, but also the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the commanders of the Army and naval bases in Hawaii. It posits that all these individuals, many of whom were lifelong military men with deep personal loyalty to their troops, would have collectively agreed to the mass sacrifice of sailors and soldiers under their command. The idea strains credulity. What we see in the historical record is not a sinister cover-up, but a cascade of more mundane yet catastrophic human and bureaucratic failures. Warnings were sent to Pearl Harbor. A message from Washington on November 27, 1941, explicitly warned that an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. But the local commanders, General Walter Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel, interpreted this as a warning against sabotage, not a massive carrier-based aerial assault. They parked their planes wingtip to make them easier to guard, creating perfect targets for bombers, and focused their naval patrols on defending against underwater incursions, leaving the harbor's air approaches dangerously unmonitored. The ultimate tragedy of Pearl Harbor, then, is not one of malicious intent but of catastrophic misinterpretation. The United States had the priceless advantage of reading its enemy's diplomatic mail, but that intelligence was incomplete, ambiguous, and filtered through a prism of preconceived notions and institutional arrogance. The real failure was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that Japan would dare such a strike, and a systemic breakdown in connecting the scattered dots that pointed toward Hawaii. The conspiracy theory endures because it offers a simpler, more emotionally satisfying explanation than the chaotic, messy truth. It is easier to accept a narrative of a cunning, if ruthless, master plan than to confront the frightening reality that sometimes, despite having many of the pieces, intelligent and dedicated people can still fail to see the picture until it is painted in fire and explosions. The enigma of Pearl Harbor is not whether there was a conspiracy, but how so many small errors and misjudgments could converge with such horrific precision, a lesson in the limits of intelligence that would echo through the decades to come. But for 50 years, the most powerful secrets in America weren't locked in a vault overseas. They were held in the private office of a man who never carried a weapon, never made an arrest, and never won an election. We now turn to a story of domestic espionage and psychological terror that unfolded not in a foreign capital, but in the corridors of Washington, D.C., centered on the most feared man in the nation's history, J. Edgar Hoover. For nearly half a century, from 1924 until his death in 1972, Hoover reigned as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, serving under 8 presidents. He built the FBI from a scandal-ridden agency into a modern, scientific law enforcement powerhouse, a force that captured celebrated gangsters and exposed Nazi spies. Yet, this public image of incorruptible American virtue was a carefully constructed facade, behind which Hoover operated a personal intelligence empire whose true purpose was the accumulation and maintenance of his own unparalleled power. The engine of this secret empire was his collection of confidential files, a shadow archive so potent it was whispered that it held the power to destroy presidents. These were the infamous secret files, though Hoover himself preferred the more bureaucratic term, official and confidential files. They were not standard case files, they were dossiers of personal dirt, a sprawling collection of rumors, allegations, and verified truths about the most prominent figures in American life. The subjects ranged from presidents like John F. Kennedy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon B. Johnson, to civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., to Hollywood celebrities, Supreme Court justices, and members of Congress. The contents were often salacious and deeply personal, evidence of extramarital affairs, whispered allegations of sexual proclivities, unsubstantiated rumors of corruption, and transcripts of illegally recorded private conversations. Hoover's method was simple and devastatingly effective. He would learn a damaging secret about a powerful person, and then, through a discreet comment in a private meeting or a strategically leaked hint, he would make it known to that person that he possessed this information. He rarely needed to explicitly threaten anyone. The mere knowledge that J. Edgar Hoover held your file was enough to ensure compliance, silence criticism, and secure the Bureau's ever-expanding budget and autonomy. It was a silent, one-sided form of blackmail that kept every potential rival in a state of perpetual check. The most chilling example of this power in action was his long-running campaign against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover was personally and ideologically opposed to the civil rights movement, which he erroneously viewed as a breeding ground for communist influence. The FBI launched an intensive surveillance operation against King, codenamed Zorro, bugging his hotel rooms and taping his private phone calls. The goal was not to uncover criminal activity, but to gather evidence of King's extramarital affairs. When they accumulated what they believed was compromising material, Hoover's aides sent an anonymous package to King's home, which contained a selection of the tapes and a letter that was presented as being from a disillusioned former supporter. The letter urged King to commit suicide, stating, "You are done. There is but one way out for you." This was not just political hardball, it was a psychologically brutal attempt to destroy a man's spirit and drive him to self-annihilation. Yet, even in the face of this, no president felt they could fire Hoover, largely because each one lived with the gnawing fear that the director's files contained something devastating about them too. This leads us directly to the most tantalizing and persistent mystery surrounding Hoover himself: the nature of his own personal life and the rumors that he, too, had secrets he was desperate to conceal. For decades, rumors have swirled that Hoover was a closeted gay man or a cross-dresser. The most famous and unverified story, circulated by longtime New York mob boss Mayor Lansky, claims that the mafia had obtained compromising photographs of Hoover engaging in cross-dressing activities at a party, and that this was the real reason the FBI director was notoriously reluctant to aggressively pursue organized crime figures for much of his career. Whether this specific story is true is almost beside the point. Its power lies in what it represents. The man who held the most damaging secrets of others was, according to the rumors, living a life that defied the strict, conservative moral code he publicly enforced. The supreme blackmailer was, in this narrative, potentially vulnerable to blackmail himself, a paradox that makes his story all the more complex and shrouded in speculation. The ultimate fate of these secret files is the final, enduring enigma. When Hoover died in his sleep in May 1972, the question of what to do with his archives became a matter of immediate and intense concern for the Nixon White House and Hoover's longtime private secretary, Helen Gandy. Miss Gandy, acting on what she claimed were Hoover's specific, long-standing instructions, spent the days following his death systematically destroying his entire collection of personal files. She stated that these were his private property and had no official bearing on FBI business, but this act of destruction only deepened the mystery. What exactly did those shredded documents contain? Were they truly limited to personal correspondence, or did they include the most explosive, official and confidential dossiers? The official story is that the blackmail files were absorbed into the FBI's general records and were eventually released to the public through the National Archives, albeit with many portions redacted. Yet, many researchers and historians are skeptical. They believe that the most sensitive files, the ones that could have toppled presidencies or revealed the deepest state secrets, were either destroyed by Gandy or were secretly transferred to a secure location outside the Bureau's official custody. This leaves us with a haunting possibility that continues to fuel investigations and books to this day. Did a complete set of Hoover's most damning files survive? Could they be stored in a private vault or a hidden archive unknown to the public, perhaps controlled by Hoover's heirs or by shadowy figures within the intelligence community? The existence of even a single, untouched file could rewrite our understanding of 20th century American history. The ghost of J. Edgar Hoover, therefore, has never truly left the building. His legacy is not just the modern FBI or his controversial tactics. It is the lingering fear that somewhere, in a locked drawer or a forgotten safe, the old man's secrets still hold power, a permanent and unsettling reminder of how one man weaponized information to build an unassailable fortress of influence, the full blueprint of which may be lost, but whose shadow still falls long across American political landscape. But from the shadowy world of Hoover's files, we journey to a story that stands in stark contrast, a tale not of cynical power but of breathtaking courage, a story whose abrupt and tragic end has left a void in our understanding of 20th century history. The mystery of Raoul Wallenberg is one of the Cold War's most profound enigmas, precisely because it began with such a brilliant and public act of heroism. In the summer of 1944, the final, desperate phase of the Holocaust was underway in Hungary. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the genocide, was orchestrating the deportation of Budapest's last major Jewish community to the death camps at a blistering pace, with hundreds of thousands already murdered. Into this maelstrom of evil stepped a 32-year-old Swedish businessman and diplomat, armed not with weapons but with a brilliant mind, unshakable courage, and a seemingly endless supply of ingenuity. Sent by the American War Refugee Board and assigned to the Swedish legation in Budapest, Wallenberg's official mission was to issue protective passports to Jews with any connection to Sweden. But he immediately transformed this bureaucratic task into a one-man rescue operation of staggering audacity. His methods were as creative as they were fearless. He designed a special Swedish protective passport, the Schutzpass, a document that had no real legal standing but looked so official and imposing with its blue and yellow colors and large crowns that Nazi and Hungarian Arrow Cross Guards were often intimidated into honoring it. He purchased and rented over 30 buildings throughout Budapest, declaring them extraterritorial Swedish soil and flying the Swedish flag, creating a network of safe houses that ultimately sheltered close to 10,000 people. He would personally rush to deportation trains, climbing onto the boxcars and handing his protective passes through the slats, boldly confronting armed guards and sometimes snatching people directly from their grasp by insisting they were under Swedish protection. In one legendary incident, when he learned that a train filled with Schutzpass holders was about to leave for Auschwitz, he drove his car directly onto the tracks, stood on the hood, and demanded the release of every person on his list, waving his documents and refusing to back down until the befuddled and threatened Nazi officials finally complied. It is estimated that through these daring actions, Raoul Wallenberg saved the lives of at least 20,000 and perhaps as many as 100,000 Hungarian Jews. Then, in January 1945, as the Soviet Red Army closed in on Budapest and finally liberated the city from the Nazis, Wallenberg's story took its fateful and mysterious turn. On January 17th, determined to ensure the safety of those in his care and potentially to propose reconstruction plans to the Soviet military command, he set out with his driver for the city of Debrecen, where the Soviet headquarters was located. He told his colleagues, "I'm going to see General Malinovsky. Whether I go as a guest or a prisoner, I do not know yet." Those were the last words anyone from the free world would ever hear from him. He and his driver were detained by Soviet troops, and from that moment forward, Raoul Wallenberg vanished into the labyrinth of the Soviet state security system. For weeks, his colleagues at the Swedish legation made frantic inquiries but were met with a wall of silence. It was the beginning of a diplomatic and historical mystery that has now lasted for nearly 80 years. The initial Soviet explanation, when they finally provided one, was as convenient as it was unsatisfying. In April 1945, the Soviet-controlled Hungarian radio announced that Wallenberg had been murdered while traveling to Debrecen, presumably by Nazis or Hungarian Arrow Cross militants. However, just 2 years later, as the Cold War hardened, a different story emerged from a most unlikely source. A Swedish diplomat visiting Moscow was told by his Soviet counterpart, almost in passing, that Wallenberg was not dead at all, but was actually under the protection of the Soviet government. This shocking admission prompted decades of official inquiries from Sweden, which were met with decades of official obfuscation from the Soviet Union. It wasn't until 1957, after years of pressure, that the Soviets finally issued a formal but highly suspect report. They claimed that Wallenberg had indeed been taken into custody in 1945 as a suspected spy, and that he had died of a heart attack in Lubyanka prison on July 17, 1947. To support this, they produced a handwritten entry in a prison register and a few other documents, but the report was riddled with inconsistencies and the evidence felt deliberately incomplete. This official Soviet narrative raises more questions than it answers, and it is the source of the enduring mystery. Why would the Soviets arrest and imprison a universally acclaimed humanitarian who had just helped defeat their sworn enemy? The most plausible theory is rooted in the paranoia of Stalinist Russia. Joseph Stalin and his secret police chief, Lavrentiy Beria, were deeply suspicious of any foreigner, especially one operating with such independence and effectiveness in a soon-to-be Soviet sphere of influence. They likely believed Wallenberg was an American spy. His mission was partly funded by the United States, and his heroic actions, while morally pure, could have been misinterpreted by a paranoid regime as a cover for intelligence gathering aimed at establishing a Western foothold in post-war Hungary. In the eyes of the NKVD, Wallenberg was not a savior. He was a dangerous, unknown variable. The even more agonizing question, however, is what truly happened after July 17, 1947. The Soviet heart attack story has been widely discredited. Numerous eyewitness accounts from former Gulag prisoners and even some Soviet officials place Wallenberg alive in various prisons and penal camps years after his official date of death. A former German prisoner of war claimed to have shared a cell with Wallenberg in 1951. A former KGB major stated in the 1990s that the order to execute Wallenberg came directly from Stalin and Beria, and that it was carried out not in 1947, but in 1945, just weeks after his capture. Another account suggests he was transferred to a psychiatric prison, where he may have been kept alive for years as a special, unnamed prisoner. The confusion itself is likely deliberate, a classic KGB tactic of spreading disinformation to obscure a dark truth. The full truth of Raoul Wallenberg's fate and the identity of the person who gave the final order to make him disappear remains locked in KGB archives that have never been fully opened, despite promises from the Russian government. His story is a haunting coda to the Holocaust and a dark inauguration of the Cold War, a permanent reminder of how one of the world's greatest heroes could be swallowed by the very system he might have hoped would help him, his ultimate sacrifice becoming a secret that a paranoid empire chose to keep forever. While the KGB perfected tools of intimate assassination and J. Edgar Hoover stockpiled personal secrets, another institution was grappling with its own sprawling legacy of shadowy operations, leading to a crisis that would force it to confront its darkest self. This brings us to the CIA's infamous family jewels, a document whose very name evokes a trove of illicit treasures, but which in reality was a catalogue of institutional sins so disturbing it threatened to tear the agency apart. The story begins in the early 1970s, a period of profound national soul-searching for the United States. The Vietnam War was raging, the Watergate scandal was unraveling, and public trust in the government was at an all-time low. It was in this volatile atmosphere that a series of investigative journalists, most notably Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, began publishing explosive allegations that the Central Intelligence Agency had been conducting massive, illegal domestic spying operations against American citizens, specifically targeting anti-war activists and political dissidents. The revelations sent shockwaves through Washington, prompting the newly appointed CIA director, James Schlesinger, to take drastic action in an attempt to get ahead of the scandal. Fearing that the agency was a ticking time bomb of potential criminal exposure, Schlesinger issued a directive in May 1973 that was as unprecedented as it was desperate. He ordered every single employee, from veteran case officers to junior analysts, to report any past or present agency activities that might fall outside the CIA's legal charter. The result of this internal confessional was a 700-page compilation of memos and reports, a document so sensitive it was given the deliberately anodyne codename Family Jewels by the CIA's Director of Security. This was not a proud collection of triumphs. It was a sprawling, damning anthology of the agency's most reckless and illegal exploits, a secret history written by its own participants. The document laid bare a stunning array of operations that violated the CIA's founding principle to operate only overseas, revealing a secret domestic war against the American people. When a heavily redacted version of the family jewels was finally declassified in 2007, the public could finally see the breathtaking scope of these illegalities. The report detailed a vast, clandestine program known as Operation Chaos, which ran from 1967 to 1973. Under Chaos, the CIA, whose mandate explicitly forbade domestic operations, systematically spied on American anti-war and civil rights groups. Agents infiltrated political organizations, compiled files on over 7,000 American citizens, and created a massive computer database to track the personal relationships and activities of people like Dr. Benjamin Spock and Jane Fonda. Beyond domestic spying, the jewels included audacious assassination plots against foreign leaders, most notably the repeated attempts to kill Cuba's Fidel Castro, which involved comical yet deadly schemes like poisoning his cigars, contaminating his diving suit with a deadly fungus, and enlisting the American mafia to carry out the hit. The document also confirmed the agency's shocking experimentation on unwitting American citizens through the MK-Ultra program, which tested mind-control substances like LSD, often with devastating psychological consequences for the subjects. It even included bizarre and sordid details, such as the surveillance of muckraking journalist Jack Anderson and a plan to infiltrate a foreign intelligence service by using a specially prepared cat equipped with a listening device, a project that ended when the cat was hit by a taxi during its first field test. But the true, enduring mystery of the family jewels is not what we learned, but what was deliberately hidden from us. The publicly released version is a forest of black ink with entire pages and countless paragraphs censored. These redactions are the focal point for historians and conspiracy theorists alike, representing the agency's final line of defense for its most sensitive secrets. The most tantalizing blacked-out sections are believed to concern the identities of the specific American citizens and journalists who were targeted, the names of foreign leaders the U.S. government actively tried to murder, and the full, unvarnished details of the CIA's collaboration with organized crime figures. There is intense speculation that one of the most heavily redacted portions details a specific and potentially successful assassination plot that the government is still unwilling to acknowledge. Another theory suggests the concealed passages might reveal the extent of the CIA's involvement in domestic politics during the Watergate era, potentially implicating senior officials in activities that crossed the line from intelligence gathering into political espionage. The critical question that arises from these deliberate omissions is a fundamental one about power and accountability. The redactions were justified on the grounds of protecting sources and methods, but many argue they serve a different purpose: to protect the agency and its political masters from legal liability and historical judgment. By keeping the most damning specifics secret, the CIA effectively contains the scandal, preventing a full public reckoning with the most egregious abuses of its power. The existence of the family jewels, even in its censored form, stands as a monumental testament to a period when the intelligence community operated with almost unchecked autonomy, believing its mission justified any means. Yet, its incompleteness is a permanent reminder that the full story of that era remains locked away, a ghost in the machine of American democracy that continues to challenge our understanding of the balance between national security and the very laws and principles that security is meant to defend. Shifting our focus from the Cold War's institutional confessions to the very birth of American intelligence, we find a story built not on files and official reports, but on whispers, coded ink, and a ghost who may have saved the revolution itself. This is the enigma of Agent 355, a name that is not a name, a specter in the historical record whose existence is both pivotal and perfectly obscured. During the darkest days of the American Revolutionary War, General George Washington was losing the battle for New York. He was desperately outgunned and outmaneuvered by the British forces occupying the city, and he realized that traditional warfare would lead to certain defeat. His solution was to create a secret weapon, a covert intelligence network operating right under the enemy's nose. This was the Culper Ring, a small, tightly knit group of spies based in New York City and Long Island, whose communications were so secretive that Washington himself often did not know their true identities. They used invisible ink, coded messages, and a complex system of dead drops and trusted couriers. And within their ranks, according to the few surviving documents, was an agent referred to only by the number 355. In the cryptic numerical code the Culper Ring used, numbers replaced the names of key people and places to protect them if their messages were intercepted. George Washington was numbered 711, New York was 727. A particularly notorious British intelligence officer was numbered 721. The number 355 stands out because in the codebook it simply means a lady. This was not a generic term, it was a specific designation for a female member of the ring, an asset whose contributions were significant enough to warrant her own code number. The evidence for her crucial role emerges from the aftermath of the war's most infamous act of treason, Benedict Arnold's plot to surrender the vital American fort at West Point to the British in 1780. The Culper Ring, through its intelligence gathering in New York, had learned that a high-ranking American officer was negotiating with the enemy. While the exact messages are lost, the legend, supported by later accounts from ring members like Benjamin Tallmadge, credits Agent 355 with providing the specific intelligence that confirmed Arnold was the traitor. Her information, funneled through the ring's channels, alerted Washington to the conspiracy, though not quite in time to prevent Arnold's escape to the British lines. Her actions, it is believed, helped preserve the Continental Army from a potentially catastrophic internal collapse. The central, captivating mystery, of course, is who was this unnamed woman. The fact that her identity was so well protected, even from Washington, suggests she was someone moving in high society, someone with access to the most sensitive British conversations. One of the most compelling theories points to Anna Strong, a prominent farmer's wife who lived near the ring's base on Long Island. According to local law, she used a specific code to signal the ring's boatman, Caleb Brewster, by hanging a black petticoat on her clothesline along with a certain number of handkerchiefs, indicating the cove where he could safely make contact. While this story is plausible and places her firmly within the ring's operations, it doesn't fully explain the high-level intelligence about Arnold's plot, which would have been discussed among British officers in the city, not on a Long Island farm. This leads to a second and perhaps more dramatic theory, that Agent 355 was a member of the glittering social elite in British-occupied New York. She could have been someone like Elizabeth Burgin or Sarah Livingston, women who moved in circles where high-ranking British officers let their guard down. Imagine a grand ball in a Manhattan mansion where a charming American loyalist or a woman pretending to be one listens as a tipsy British major boasts about a soon-to-be defected American general. In this scenario, 355 was not just a passive informant but an active participant in the social whirl, using her wit and status to extract secrets that would never be shared in a military briefing. She was the perfect spy because she was, in the eyes of the enemy, completely above suspicion, her true allegiances hidden behind a fan and a smile. A third, more tragic possibility is that she was someone with far less social power, perhaps a maid, a cook, or even the enslaved servant of a prominent loyalist or British officer. Invisible by virtue of her class and status, she could have overheard crucial conversations while serving dinner or tidying a study, places where confidential papers were left carelessly in the open. This theory carries a profound weight, suggesting that one of the revolution's greatest heroes was a woman whose freedom the new nation she helped create would not even guarantee. It also provides a grimly logical explanation for why her name was so thoroughly erased, to protect her from brutal reprisal, or perhaps because the historians of the era simply did not consider the testimony of a servant or an enslaved person worth recording for posterity. Ultimately, the fate of Agent 355 is as unknown as her identity. There is no pension record, no gravestone, no memoir that bears her name. There is a haunting and unverified story that a female American spy was captured by the British and died aboard the infamous prison ship HMS Jersey, a rotting hulk in New York Harbor where thousands of American prisoners perished in horrific conditions. If true, this would mean she died in the very waters she had worked to free, her sacrifice as anonymous as her service. The power of her story lies in this profound silence. She is the ultimate symbol of the hidden contributions that shaped a nation, a reminder that history is not only written by the famous generals and statesmen we can name, but also by the countless unseen individuals who risked everything in the shadows. Agent 355 remains a beautiful, frustrating, and essential ghost, her true story a secret the Culper Ring managed to keep for nearly 250 years, a final, perfect testament to their effectiveness. And so we arrive at a tragedy that unfolded not in the shadowy corners of a city, but in the dark African night, a crash that extinguished one of the 20th century's most principled voices and left behind a mystery that challenges the very idea of international justice. On September 18, 1961, a Douglas DC-6 aircraft named the Albertina took off from Leopoldville, bound for Ndola in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. On board was Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, a man described as an aloof intellectual who had undergone a profound spiritual transformation, emerging as a fierce and independent champion for peace. He was flying on a desperate personal mission to negotiate a ceasefire in the vicious Congo crisis, a complex and bloody conflict fueled by the competing interests of the Cold War superpowers and the dying gasps of European colonialism. The Congo's first prime minister, the charismatic Patrice Lumumba, had been deposed and assassinated just months earlier, and the country was splintering, with the mineral-rich province of Katanga declaring independence with the backing of powerful Western mining interests and foreign mercenaries. Hammarskjöld saw this as a direct threat to the sovereignty of a new nation and to the authority of the UN itself. He was determined to face down the Katangan leader, Moise Tshom, and end the fighting. He never made it. Just after midnight, his plane plummeted from the sky, crashing into a heavily forested area just miles from the Ndola airport. There were no survivors. Hammarskjöld, along with 15 others, was killed. The official investigation, conducted by a Rhodesian board of inquiry, concluded that the crash was an accident. The pilot, they asserted, had simply misjudged his altitude during the final approach, leading to a controlled flight into terrain. This explanation was accepted by many at the time, a tragic but straightforward end to a perilous journey. Yet, from the very beginning, this official narrative was riddled with inconsistencies and haunted by the testimony of those who were there. African witnesses on the ground near the crash site reported seeing not one but 2 planes in the sky that night. They spoke of a smaller, faster aircraft circling the Albertina before a flash of light and the sound of an explosion. A Swedish flight controller stationed in the region reported hearing a pilot radio a distress call saying, "I see fire coming from my plane." Another controller claimed to have heard a final, chilling transmission. "The whole plane is on fire, it's crashing." These accounts painted a picture not of a simple pilot error but of an aerial attack. The official inquiry dismissed this testimony, often attributing it to the unreliability of local witnesses or the confusion of the dark night, but the questions refused to die. Why was the flight path so unusually low? Why were there strange, unexplained holes in the wreckage that some observers likened to bullet holes? And most perplexingly, why was there a playing card, the Ace of Spades, found neatly placed on Hammarskjöld's collar at the crash site? A detail some have interpreted as a mercenary's calling card or a deliberate symbol of death. This mountain of doubt has nurtured several compelling and deeply troubling theories about who would have wanted Dag Hammarskjöld dead. The most prominent theory points directly to the very forces he was flying to confront: the combination of Katanga's secessionist government and the multinational corporations, like the Belgian Union Minière du Haut Katanga, that profited immensely from the province's copper and cobalt wealth. Hammarskjöld's unwavering support for a unified Congo and his authorization of UN troops to end Katanga's rebellion posed an existential threat to their financial empire. It is entirely plausible that Tisham's regime, aided by the ruthless European mercenaries known as Lesser Fru, the Terrible Ones, who made up his air force, could have dispatched a fighter plane to intercept and destroy the Albertina. This was a chaotic conflict where mercenaries operated with a sense of impunity, and eliminating the UN chief would have been a devastating blow to the international effort against them. A second, even more sinister theory implicates Western intelligence agencies, specifically the British MI6 and the American CIA. While this may sound like the stuff of conspiracy thrillers, it is grounded in the hard realities of Cold War geopolitics. Declassified documents and subsequent investigations have revealed that both London and Washington viewed Hammarskjöld with deep suspicion and growing hostility. They saw him as an obstacle to their interests in a post-colonial Africa. The British government, in particular, had significant economic ties to Katanga and was furious with the UN's military intervention. A secret cable from the American National Security Agency even referred to Hammarskjöld as the #1 neutralist, a label that, in the paranoid lexicon of the Cold War, was only a step away from communist sympathizer. We know for a fact that the CIA was actively plotting coups and assassinations around the globe during this period. The idea that they, or their British counterparts, would have authorized a covert operation to remove a man they perceived as destabilizing their strategic and economic interests in a resource-rich region is tragically within the realm of possibility. It could have been a joint operation with the Katangan forces or a deniable action carried out by a proxy, leaving no direct fingerprints. The pursuit of truth has been as fraught as the mystery itself. For decades, the case was kept alive by dedicated researchers, journalists, and Hammarskjöld's own family. The persistence paid off. In 2015, a former UN official and a South African judge published a report that found new, credible witness testimony supporting the aerial attack theory. This led the UN General Assembly to formally reopen the investigation. A subsequent independent panel of jurists concluded in 2017 that there was significant new evidence that the plane was subject to some form of attack or threat, and that it was plausible that an external attack caused the crash. This prompted the appointment of a UN chief prosecutor to continue the inquiry, an investigation that remains officially open today. The greatest hope for a final answer lies in classified government archives in the United States, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and South Africa. Files that may contain intercepted communications, intelligence briefings, or operational logs that could finally confirm what happened in the skies over Ndola. Yet, these documents remain stubbornly sealed, their contents protected by claims of national security. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld is more than just an unsolved aviation disaster. It is a permanent stain on the conscience of the international community. It raises the terrifying possibility that the man who represented the world's greatest hope for peace was himself a victim of the very forces of greed, violence, and realpolitik he dedicated his life to fighting. A martyr whose final mission ended not in a tragic mistake, but in a calculated act of murder, the truth of which is still being fought over more than 60 years later. And so we return to the Cambridge Five, the spy ring that represented not a single breach, but a systemic failure, a hemorrhage of secrets that lasted for decades. We know the names that have passed into infamy: Philby, Burgess, McLean, Blunt, and Cairncross. Their stories are etched into the history of the Cold War as a quintet of traitors. Yet the very act of naming them, of closing the book on this notorious group, may be the greatest misdirection of all. For buried within the thousands of pages of decrypted Soviet communications lies a ghost, the persistent and unsettling evidence that the inner circle of British betrayal was not a closed set of five, but potentially an open-ended network, with its most elusive members having never been dragged into the light. This is the enigma of the third man and beyond, a mystery that suggests the most dangerous traitor of all might be the one who was never caught. The primary source for this haunting possibility is the Venona Project, a top-secret American counterintelligence program that began during World War II. American and British cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to break the complex ciphers used by Soviet intelligence agencies in their diplomatic and espionage traffic. Over years, they achieved sporadic but stunning success, decoding thousands of messages that exposed a vast Soviet spy network operating within the West. It was within these fragmented, often frustratingly incomplete decryptions that the codenames of the Cambridge Five first appeared. But the Venona cables did more than just confirm the guilt of the known spies, they whispered of others. The decrypts referenced high-level agents whose identities have never been conclusively matched to any of the famous five. There were mentions of sources within British intelligence with access so sensitive and cover so deep that they appear to have operated on a different level entirely, their code names appearing in contexts that suggest they were the crown jewels of the Soviet arsenal in London. One of the most tantalizing of these spectral figures is an agent codenamed Molière. The Venona transcripts show Molière providing intelligence of the highest caliber from within the very heart of MI6 during the war. The traffic describes the material as of enormous value and exclusively from Molière. While Kim Philby is known to have been a prolific source, some intelligence historians have argued that the volume and specific nature of the reports attributed to Molière do not perfectly align with what we know of Philby's postings and access at the time. This has led to a compelling and disturbing theory that Molière was not Philby at all, but a separate, distinct, and even more highly placed asset who was never identified. This individual would have been the ultimate third man, a phantom operating in parallel to Philby, perhaps even unknown to him, a double insurance policy planted by the KGB at the pinnacle of British intelligence. The implication is staggering that while the world was fixated on the hunt for Philby, the real prize, the most valuable Soviet mole, may have retired comfortably with a knighthood and a full pension, his secret dying with him. The clues do not stop with Molière. Other decoded messages refer to agents with cryptonyms like David and Baron, individuals who are clearly providing political and military intelligence from within the British establishment. Then there is the mysterious case of the Ring of Five itself. The very name is a historical convenience, but Soviet communications sometimes referred to a larger group. When Anthony Blunt finally confessed in 1964, he was offered immunity in exchange for his full cooperation. During his debriefing, he was shown the Venona decrypts. The interrogators hoped he would finally put names to all the remaining code names. Yet Blunt, even with his back against the wall, either could not or would not identify every single individual referenced. He confirmed the identities he knew, but there were ghosts in the machine that even he could not exorcise. Was this because these agents were from a different, parallel network that Blunt was not part of? Or was it a final act of tradecraft, a lifelong communist adhering to his oath of secrecy to protect comrades whose success was so complete they had become invisible? The practical and political reasons why these ghosts were never pursued to a conclusive end are as murky as the identities themselves. The Venona evidence was by its nature fragmentary and often could not be used in a court of law without revealing the supreme secret that the West had broken Soviet codes. To arrest someone based on a partial decryption would have tipped off the Kremlin, causing them to change their ciphers and blinding the Americans and British to future espionage. This created an agonizing dilemma for the security services. They knew there were unrecovered traitors in their midst, but exposing them would cost them their most vital intelligence source. Furthermore, by the 1950s and 60s, the sheer scale of the Cambridge scandal was a profound national humiliation. There was a powerful, unspoken incentive within the British government to close the book, to pin the blame on the 5 known men and declare the case solved. To admit that the cancer was even more widespread, that it might have reached into the very highest levels of the civil service, the judiciary, or even Downing Street, would have triggered a political crisis from which the establishment might not have recovered. This leaves us with a legacy of profound and unsettling uncertainty. The known members of the Cambridge Five were eventually exposed, defected, or confessed. But the ghosts suggested by the Venona project, agents like Molière, never were. They would have lived out their lives in positions of honor and trust, their loyalty never questioned, their secrets buried in classified archives. Every knighthood bestowed on a seemingly dedicated civil servant, every quiet retirement of a respected diplomat, carries the faint, haunting echo of a question mark. The mystery of the third man and his successors is therefore the ultimate espionage ghost story. It is not about what we know, but about what we can never truly know. The possibility that the greatest triumph of Soviet intelligence was not the spies who were caught, but the ones who were so perfectly embedded that they became indistinguishable from the institution they were betraying, leaving behind a permanent shadow of doubt over an entire era of British history. And so, we have journeyed together through 25 of history's deepest and most shadowy rabbit holes, from the gilded cage of the man in the iron mask to the silent, ruthless efficiency of North Korea's Room 39. We have witnessed the intimate betrayal of the Cambridge Five, the heartbreaking vanishing of heroes like Raoul Wallenberg, and the explosive political manipulation of forgeries like the Habush letter. Each of these unsolved cases is more than a mere historical footnote. It is a tear in the fabric of our accepted narrative, a stubborn question mark written in invisible ink across the official record. They reveal a fundamental truth about the human story, that the most pivotal moments are often shaped not in the public square, but in the whispers between agents, in the quiet hum of a code-breaking machine, and in the decisions made in smoke-filled rooms where truth is not just stretched, but becomes the very first and most deliberate casualty. These mysteries force us to acknowledge that the history we think we know is often just the cover story, a carefully curated version of events designed to protect reputations, secure power, or bury an inconvenient secret forever. Yet, the enduring power of these enigmas is not solely in their complexity, but in the way they invite us to participate. History is not a closed book to be memorized, but an active crime scene, and we are all invited to examine the evidence. The very fact that these cases remain open, that they continue to be debated by historians and amateurs alike, means the investigation is still ongoing. You are now an armchair detective, equipped with the same fragments of clues, the same puzzling contradictions, and the same burning curiosity that has driven researchers for decades. Which of these 25 cases keeps you up at night? Do you find yourself drawn to the tragic human drama of the Somerton man, or does your mind gravitate toward the grand geopolitical chess game of the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure? Perhaps you have a theory about the true identity of Agent 355, or you believe you've spotted a flaw in the official story of Dag Hammarskjöld's crash. The comment section below is our collective detective's notebook, a place to share your thoughts, your favorite unsolved mystery from the list, and your own brilliant speculations. The conversation is what keeps these stories alive, and your perspective might just be the one that connects the dots no one else has seen. This exploration into the clandestine world of spies and secrets is just the beginning. The corridors of history are long and filled with countless more locked doors waiting to be opened. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world's greatest historical puzzles, if you relish the thrill of the unknown and the satisfaction of questioning everything, then you are in the right place. We are dedicated to unearthing these hidden narratives, to pulling back the curtain on the past's greatest deceptions and disappearances. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the world's most captivating mysteries, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your curiosity is the most valuable tool in any detective's kit, and together we can continue to search for the truths that history has tried so